Here's what nobody tells you about being chosen by fate. It doesn't ask if you're ready. The kingdom of Vaelor buried its last true king 2 centuries ago, and the empire's been rotting from the inside ever since. They called her defective, branded her worthless, marched her toward what everyone believed was execution. But when Selene Veyr touched that ancient seal, the mountain didn't swallow her whole. It gave her back something the world thought was dead. A king who'd been waiting 200 years for the one soul strong enough to stand beside him. And trust me, what happens next will rip your heart out and rebuild it stronger. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know where my tribe is watching from. The iron doors of Blackthorn Citadel opened at dawn, and Selene Veyr knew this was the day she would die. She'd scrubbed these marble floors for 6 years, always keeping her eyes down, her movements small, her existence as invisible as the servants the nobles pretended not to see. The other Omegas whispered about her at night in the sleeping quarters, their voices carrying through thin walls like smoke. Defective, they said. Broken. A wolf who never manifested was worse than human, because at least humans knew what they were. Selene knew what she was too. She was nothing. The head servant, a severe woman named Ryeth, with silver streaking through her dark hair, appeared in the doorway of the servants' bathing room where Selene had been scrubbing her skin raw with lye soap. The older woman's face carried no expression, but her hands trembled slightly as she held out a white ceremonial robe. "You've been called for the rite," Wraith said quietly. Selene's hands stilled in the water. The soap dissolved between her fingers like her last shred of hope. Every servant in the Citadel knew what the rite meant. The Dominion Council selected one Omega every decade for their ancient ritual, always someone expendable, always someone whose disappearance would cause no political complications, always someone who never came back. When? Selene heard herself ask, surprised her voice worked at all. Now. The robbing chamber smelled of incense and old fear. 2 attendants dressed Selene in silence, their movements efficient and impersonal as they wrapped the white fabric around her thin frame. She'd lost weight over the winter. The Citadel's servants ate what the nobles left behind, and there had been many state dinners lately, which meant more waste than usual, but Selene's stomach had forgotten how to feel hunger weeks ago. One attendant braided her pale blonde hair, while another painted her lips with rouge the color of fresh arterial blood. Selene watched her reflection appear in the bronze mirror and barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back. 22 years old, and she looked ancient. The Dominion Council waited in the throne cathedral, a massive chamber of black stone and stained glass where morning light filtered through in fractured colors. 5 alpha warlords sat elevated on obsidian thrones, each one draped in furs and jewels and the absolute certainty of their power. Lord Malric occupied the center throne. His silver hair fell to his shoulders in perfect waves, and his eyes held the flat, dead quality of someone who'd ordered so many executions he'd stopped counting. He smiled when Selene was brought before them in silver chains. "The defective one," he said, his voice carrying through the cathedral like a judgment already passed. "How appropriate." The other council members laughed. Lord Torvin, the youngest, leaned forward with interest. "She doesn't even have the scent of a proper Omega." "What makes you think she'll survive the journey to the Ashen Veil?" "She won't," Malric replied calmly. "That's rather the point." Selene kept her eyes on the floor. She'd learned years ago that eye contact with alphas only brought pain. The chains around her wrists were pure silver, burning against her skin with that particular agony reserved for wolf-blooded creatures. Even without a manifested wolf, she still carried enough of the bloodline for silver to hurt. "The rite of Hollow Kings had been performed for centuries," Malric continued, rising from his throne and descending the steps toward her with predatory grace, a sacrifice to appease the restless dead. "Every decade we send an offering to the tomb, and every decade the kingdom prospers." He stopped directly in front of Selene, so close she could smell the wine on his breath and the expensive oils in his hair. "You should feel honored," he said softly. "Your meaningless life finally has purpose." Something flickered in Selene's chest then. Not anger. Not quite. Anger required the belief that you deserved better, and she'd been trained too thoroughly to believe she deserved nothing at all. But there was something, a tiny spark of defiance that tasted like copper in her mouth. "If I may ask, my lord," she said quietly, Why does a tomb need a sacrifice if the king buried there has been dead for 200 years? The cathedral fell silent. Malrek's smile widened, but his eyes went colder. Because some things, he said, are too dangerous to truly die. We keep the old monster buried with blood and ritual so he stays forgotten. And thanks to worthless creatures like you, he always will. The journey to the Ashen Veil took 3 days through terrain that grew progressively more hostile. Selene rode in a covered wagon with 4 armed guards, none of whom spoke to her. They traveled through outer provinces she'd only heard about in whispered stories, villages where children watched their passage with hungry eyes, and adults looked away quickly, as if acknowledging the white-robed figure in chains might bring bad luck. The taxes here were brutal. Selene could see it in the crumbling walls, the thin livestock, the way people moved with the exhausted shuffle of those who'd given up hoping for anything better. The Dominion Council bled these territories dry to fund their endless feasts and military campaigns, extracting tribute in gold, grain, and the bodies of young wolves conscripted into service. On the second night, when they camped in a forest clearing, one of the guards sat nearby sharpening his blade. He was younger than the others, maybe 30, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "You really got no wolf?" he asked suddenly. Selene looked up from where she sat against a tree, her chained hands resting in her lap. "No," she said. He studied her for a long moment. "That's rough. My sister was like that, never manifested. She hung herself when she was 16. The words landed between them like stones. "I'm sorry," Selene said quietly. The guard shrugged. "Everyone's sorry. Don't change nothing, though, does it?" He went back to sharpening his blade, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filling the silence. On the morning of the 3rd day, they reached the Ashen Veil. The wasteland stretched before them like a wound in the earth, a massive expanse of black cliffs and volcanic glass where nothing grew, and the sky hung perpetually dark with storm clouds. Lightning flickered in the distance without rain, illuminating jagged peaks that looked like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. The tomb entrance stood carved into the largest cliff face, a massive stone doorway covered in symbols Selene couldn't read. The guards unchained her from the wagon but left the silver shackles on her wrists. "You walk from here," the scarred guard said. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Protocol says we take you to the seal. After that, you're on your own." The path to the tomb entrance wound through a field of obsidian shards that crunched beneath Selene's bare feet. The guards walked in formation around her, weapons drawn, as if expecting attack from something that had been dead for 2 centuries. The air here tasted wrong, metallic, and sharp, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. When they reached the massive stone door, Selene saw the seal clearly. It was a circle of symbols carved deep into the rock, surrounding a handprint worn smooth by age. The stone around it had been scorched black, and the ground before the door was stained with old blood. How many other offerings had stood in this exact spot? How many other expendable lives had the Dominion fed to this place? The scarred guard produced a key and unlocked her silver chains. Her wrists ached where the metal had burned, the skin raw and blistered. "You're supposed to place your hand on the seal," he said quietly. "After that, it's up to fate." "And if I refuse?" Selene asked. He finally met her eyes. "Then we kill you here and drag your body to the seal anyway. At least this way it's your choice." Selene looked at the ancient door, at the symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in her peripheral vision, at the handprint that had pressed into stone by hands long since turned to dust. She thought about the servant quarters in Blackthorn Citadel, the endless days of scrubbing floors while nobles walked past as if she didn't exist. She thought about the scarred guard's sister hanging from a rope at 16. She thought about all the years of being told she was defective, broken, worthless. She thought about how she had nothing left to lose. Selene pressed her palm against the seal. The world exploded, not with sound, with something deeper. The mountain shook beneath her feet and the seal blazed with silver fire that burned up her arm and into her chest, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but feel the absolute certainty that she'd just woken something that should have stayed buried forever. The guards screamed. Selene heard weapons clatter against stone as they ran, their footsteps fading into the distance. But she couldn't move. The fire held her there, not burning but rewriting, pouring something ancient and furious into her blood. The stone door cracked down the center, then it shattered. Darkness poured from the tomb like a living thing, thick and cold and carrying the scent of old battlefields. Selene fell backward, her hand finally tearing free from the seal. She hit the ground hard, obsidian shards cutting into her palms as the mountain continued to shake. And then he emerged. She saw his eyes first, silver and burning with an intensity that made her soul recognize something it had no name for. Then the rest of him materialized from the darkness, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing ancient armor that had been black once but was now scorched gray. His face was hard and brutal and beautiful in the way that weapons can be beautiful, all sharp angles and predatory grace. Battle scars crossed his exposed throat and the backs of his hands. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tangled with dust from 2 centuries of burial. When he moved, every muscle flowed with lethal precision, the body of a warrior who'd survived more combat than should have been possible. But it was his presence that made Selene's breath stop. He radiated power like heat from a forge. Not the political authority of the Dominion Council, but something primal and absolute. The kind of dominance that made every instinct in her body scream to either submit or run. She did neither. Kaelor Draven, the last Alpha King of Vaelor, stood in the wasteland of his own empire and looked at the woman who'd freed him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then his expression shifted from fury to something far more dangerous. Recognition. "You," he said, his voice rough from 200 years of silence. The word came out like a judgment and a promise and a threat all at once. Selene tried to scramble backward, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The silver fire from the seal still burned through her veins, making her limbs heavy and strange. The king took a step forward, then another. He moved like a predator approaching prey, all controlled violence and inevitable conclusion. "Who sent you?" he demanded. "The Dominion Council," Selene managed, her voice shaking. "For the right, they said—" He snarled, the sound purely animal. "Those parasites still rule my empire." "They're not parasites," Selene said, surprising herself. "They're the council. They've kept the kingdom stable for—" "With what?" Kaelor cut her off, his silver eyes blazing. "Blood taxes? Endless wars? Breeding programs that treat omegas like livestock?" She flinched. How could he possibly know that? "Because I invented half those policies," he said bitterly, "before I learned what they actually cost." He was close enough now that Selene could see the exhaustion in his face beneath the rage. Whatever had kept him preserved in that tomb, it hadn't been rest. He looked like someone who'd been conscious and trapped for 2 centuries, aware of every passing moment. "They told me you were dead," she said quietly. "That this was a tomb, a sacrifice to appease your ghost." Kaelor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Dead would have been mercy. They didn't bury me. They imprisoned me. Locked me in darkness while my own council tore apart everything I built and rewrote history to make themselves the heroes. Why?" The question came out before Selene could stop it. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. The fury dimmed slightly, replaced by confusion, and then something that looked almost like pain. "Because I was becoming a monster," he said finally, "and they were terrified I'd destroy the kingdom before I destroyed myself." He reached out slowly, as if approaching something wild and skittish. His scarred hand lifted toward her face, and Selene's entire body locked with tension. She should run. She should scream. She should do literally anything except sit there while this ancient predator touched her. But when his fingers brushed her cheek, the contact sent a shock through her entire system. Not pain. Something else. Something that made the silver fire in her veins surge and her breath catch and her soul recognize a truth her mind couldn't process. The king's eyes widened. His hand froze against her skin. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible." "What?" Selene's heart hammered against her ribs. "You're mine!" His voice came out raw and shattered. "Fate bound us. 200 years they kept me buried, and you're my—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Instead, he jerked his hand back as if she'd burned him and took 3 quick steps away, his breathing ragged. "This can't be real," he said, more to himself than to her. They wouldn't have sent her here if they knew. They couldn't have known. Selene's mind spun. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand the recognition in his eyes, or the way her body responded to his proximity, or the terrible certainty growing in her chest that something fundamental had just changed. "I don't understand," she said. Kaelor looked at her with an expression caught between wonder and absolute horror. "You're my mate," he said flatly. "The one fate preserved for me across 2 centuries of imprisonment. And if the Dominion Council realizes what they've done, they'll kill us both before we make it out of this wasteland alive." The storm that had been brewing over the Ashen Veil finally broke. Rain came down in sheets, turning the obsidian field into a treacherous landscape of sharp edges and zero visibility. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating Kaelor's face in stark flashes of white. "Can you walk?" he demanded. Selene tried to stand, and her legs immediately gave out. The silver fire had left her drained and shaking. The king cursed and scooped her up with effortless strength, cradling her against his armored chest like she weighed nothing at all. His body temperature ran hot, a furnace against the cold rain, and Selene's instincts screamed at her to struggle. "Put me down," she said, "so you can collapse in the mud and die of exposure?" He started moving through the storm with inhuman speed and precision, navigating the razor-sharp terrain without hesitation. "I didn't survive 200 years of burial to watch my mate freeze to death in the first hour." "I'm not your mate," Selene said through chattering teeth. "I don't even have a wolf. I'm defective." Kaelor's arms tightened around her. "Who told you that?" "Everyone. The servants. The council. They lied." His voice cut through the storm like a blade. "You have a wolf. They just made sure she'd never wake up." "That's not possible." "Of course it's possible." The king leaped across a chasm in the rock that Selene hadn't even seen. "Political curses are older than civilization itself. The Dominion probably buried the spell before you were even conceived. Can't have the Alpha King's destined mate surviving long enough to free him, after all." The words hit Selene like physical blows. Her entire identity had been built on being worthless, defective, expendable. If that was a lie? If she'd been cursed from birth just to ensure she'd die unwanted and powerless, the rage that flooded through her was so sudden and complete it stole her breath. Kaelor felt her stiffen in his arms. "Good," he said grimly. "Hold on to that anger. You're going to need it." They moved through the wasteland for hours, the storm raging around them. Selene drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion and shock. She had fever dreams of symbols burning into stone, of silver fire rewriting her blood, of eyes that saw through centuries of darkness and recognized her soul. When she woke, they were in a cave carved deep into the mountainside. A fire crackled in a pit made from arranged stones, the smoke venting through a natural chimney in the rock. Kaelor sat across from her, cleaning blood from a blade that hadn't been there before. "You're awake," he said without looking up. Selene pushed herself upright, her body aching everywhere. "Whose blood is that?" "Hunters. 3 of them tracked us into the peaks." He finally met her eyes. "The council moves faster than I expected." "You killed them?" His expression didn't change. "They were going to kill you. What did you expect me to do?" "Let them," Selene said quietly. "I'm nobody. I'm not worth—" The king moved so fast she didn't see it coming. One moment he was across the fire, the next he had her pinned against the cave wall, his hands on either side of her head, his face inches from hers. "Don't," he said, his voice deadly soft. "Don't you dare tell me you're worthless. I've seen empires rise and fall. I've commanded armies that could level cities. And fate itself decided you were the one soul strong enough to stand beside me. So unless you think fate is an idiot, you'll shut your mouth about being nobody." Selene's pulse hammered in her throat. This close, she could see flecks of darker silver in his eyes, could smell cedar and leather and something uniquely him. Every instinct told her to submit, to look away, to make herself small. Instead, she met his gaze directly. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know what I am or what I've survived. Fate might have bound us, but that doesn't mean I belong to you." Something shifted in Kaelor's expression. The fury banked slightly, replaced by what might have been respect. "Good," he said finally, pulling back. "If you'd cowered, I'd have known the council broke you completely." He returned to his position by the fire, leaving Selene shaking against the wall. "We need to move before dawn," he continued as if the last minute hadn't happened. The hunters had communication crystals. Reinforcements will be here within hours. Where are we going? Selene forced herself to sit to match his practical tone. Moonspire Keep, the ruins of my old fortress. There are loyalists there who've been waiting 2 centuries for someone to give them permission to stop hiding. You're planning a war, Selene said. It wasn't a question. Kaelor looked at her across the flames. I'm planning to take back what's mine. The Empire. The throne. Every single thing those parasites stole while I was buried. And me? The words came out smaller than she intended. What am I in your plans? The king's expression became unreadable. You're the queen fate decided this empire needed, whether you want the job or not. The weight of that statement settled over Selene like chains heavier than silver. Queen, her. The defective servant girl who'd scrubbed floors and kept her eyes down and never believed she deserved to exist at all. I don't know how to be a queen, she said. Neither did I when I first took the throne. Kaelor's voice held old bitterness. I learned. So will you. And if I refuse, then you die here, he said bluntly. Because the council knows by now that you freed me. Every hunter in the kingdom will be searching for a pale Omega in white robes. Your old life ended the moment you touched that seal. The only question is whether you're strong enough to survive what comes next. Selene looked down at her hands, at the burns on her wrists from the silver chains, at the cuts from obsidian shards that were already starting to heal faster than they should. The silver fire from the seal still hummed through her veins, quiet now, but present. Waiting. She thought about 6 years of being invisible, of scrubbing blood from ceremonial blades and never asking whose blood it was, of watching nobles feast while children in the outer provinces starved, of being told every single day that her existence didn't matter. She thought about the scarred guard's sister, 16 years old and so convinced of her worthlessness that death seemed like the better option. How many others? How many lives crushed under the weight of a system designed to keep certain people broken? Tell me about the curse, Selene said finally. The one suppressing my wolf. Kaelor studied her for a long moment. Why? Because if they went to that much trouble to keep me powerless, she met his eyes across the fire, then maybe I'm worth more than they wanted me to believe. The king smiled then, a sharp and dangerous expression that transformed his face. That, he said, is exactly the kind of thinking that makes you dangerous. He spent the next hour explaining how political curses worked, the bloodline magic required to suppress a wolf before birth, the generational planning needed to ensure a specific descendant would be targeted. The Dominion hadn't just cursed Selene. They'd cursed her entire family line going back decades. Your grandmother probably never manifested either, Kaelor said. Or your mother. They've been systematically destroying your bloodline for 3 generations. Why go to that much trouble? Selene's mind spun with the implications. Because your bloodline isn't just tied to mine through the mate bond. The king's expression turned grim. You're descended from the original royal family that ruled before I took the throne. The same family the Dominion massacred during their coup. Selene felt the world tilt. What? You're not just my mate. You're the last living heir to the throne by blood right. Which means, together, we're not just a political problem for the council. He leaned forward, silver eyes burning. We're an extinction-level threat to everything they've built. The cave fell silent, except for the crackling fire. So they cursed me to stay weak, Selene said slowly. Sent me to what they thought was my execution, and accidentally gave you exactly what you needed to destroy them. Kaelor's smile widened. Ironic, isn't it? What happens if the curse breaks? If my wolf wakes up? The king's expression became unreadable. Honestly? I don't know. Royal bloodline wolves haven't been seen in 200 years. If the old stories are accurate, you won't be an Omega at all. Then what will I be? Something they should have killed when they had the chance. Dawn came cold and gray through the cave entrance. Selene woke to find Kaelor already awake, standing watch by the opening with a blade in each hand. He hadn't slept at all. They're here, he said quietly. 20 mounted soldiers, full combat gear. Can we fight them? He glanced back at her. I can. You'd die in the first minute. So we run? His jaw tightened. I don't run. Even when you're outnumbered, Especially then. Selene recognized that particular brand of stubbornness. She'd seen it in the Dominion Council, the refusal to compromise even when compromise was the smart choice. It was the same arrogance that had probably gotten him imprisoned in the first place. "If you die here," she said carefully, "then everything you survived for the last 200 years was pointless." Kaelor turned to face her fully. "You think I'm being reckless. I think you're being an idiot." His eyebrows rose. "Most people don't talk to me like that. Most people probably ended up dead." Selene stood, ignoring her aching muscles. "If we can't fight and you won't run, then we need a third option." "What do you suggest?" She thought about 6 years of being invisible, of moving through the citadel like a ghost, of survival through going unnoticed. "We hide," she said, "but not in here. We hide in plain sight." Kaelor studied her with new interest. How? The king clearly hadn't spent the last 200 years learning how servants survived, but Selene had spent her entire life perfecting it. She explained quickly, the plan forming even as she spoke. The hunters would expect them to run deeper into the wasteland or try to fight. They wouldn't expect an alpha king to surrender, and they definitely wouldn't expect him to walk straight toward them with his supposed captive. "It's insane," Kaelor said when she finished, "which is why it might work." He considered this for exactly 3 seconds. Then he smiled that dangerous smile again. "You know what? Fine. But if this gets us killed, I'm going to be extremely annoyed with you. I'll try to contain my guilt." They emerged from the cave just as the sun crested the peaks. 20 soldiers on horseback surrounded the entrance, weapons drawn. Their leader was a hard-faced woman with gray in her dark hair and captain's insignia on her armor. "Kaelor Draven," she called out, her voice carrying across the rocks. "By order of the Dominion Council, you are to surrender immediately or be executed where you stand." The king spread his arms wide, weaponless and apparently defeated. He'd hidden his blades in the cave and stood now in just the scorched armor, looking every inch the broken prisoner. "I surrender," he said clearly. The captain's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Just like that? 200 years is a long time to be buried," Kaelor said tiredly. "I'm not stupid enough to fight 20 armed soldiers when I can barely walk." Selene stood slightly behind him, still wearing the white ceremonial robes now stained with mud and blood. She kept her eyes down, her posture submissive, playing the terrified captive perfectly. The captain gestured and 2 soldiers dismounted, approaching with silver chains. "And the girl?" the captain asked. Kaelor shrugged. "Expendable. Kill her if you want. She's nothing to me." The words hit exactly as they were supposed to. The soldiers relaxed slightly, convinced by the casual cruelty. Of course, an Alpha King wouldn't care about some defective Omega. That was the story the Empire had been telling for centuries. The first soldier reached Kaelor and raised the chains. The king moved. It happened so fast Selene almost missed it despite knowing it was coming. Kaelor's hand shot out and crushed the soldier's throat before he could scream. The second soldier died with the king's stolen blade through his heart. Then Kaelor's wolf erupted. Selene had never seen an alpha shift before. The transformation wasn't smooth or magical. It was violent and absolute. Bones cracked and reformed. Muscle tore and rebuilt. The scorched armor shattered as the massive black wolf exploded from inside it. He was enormous, easily twice the size of a normal wolf, with silver eyes that burned with intelligence and fury. His jaws closed around the captain's horse, and the animal went down screaming. Chaos erupted. Soldiers scattered. Some tried to fight. Most just ran. Kaelor tore through them like they were made of paper. Selene watched the slaughter with a strange detachment. This was what an Alpha King looked like when unleashed. Not the controlled violence of the cave, not the calculated strategy of their plan. This was pure predator, efficient and unstoppable. It was over in less than 3 minutes. The king stood among the bodies, blood dripping from his muzzle, chest heaving. Then he shifted back to human form, standing naked and unconcerned in the morning light. "Well," he said conversationally, "I feel better." Selene just stared at him. "What?" Kaelor walked toward her, stepping over corpses without looking down. "You said we needed a third option. I said we should hide in plain sight. We did. Then I killed them when they got close." He retrieved his blades from the cave. Seemed efficient. "You're insane," Selene said flatly. The king grinned. "You're just now figuring that out?" He scavenged armor from the dead soldiers, piecing together something that fit well enough. The movements were practiced and casual. A man who'd dressed from battlefield salvage more times than he could count. Selene found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. The scars that crossed his back. The efficient brutality of his movements. The way he could shift between charming and lethal in a heartbeat. This was the man fate had bound her to. A king who'd been imprisoned for becoming too dangerous. Who just killed 20 soldiers without breaking a sweat. Who looked at her like she was simultaneously the most precious and most terrifying thing he'd ever encountered. "We need horses," Kaelor said, buckling on a sword belt. "Moonspire Keep is 3 days from here on foot." 2 of the horses hadn't run far. Selene managed to catch them while the king finished looting. She'd never ridden before, but apparently that was just one more skill she'd need to learn quickly. Kaelor mounted with practiced ease and then pulled her up in front of him. The position forced her back against his chest, his arms bracketing her as he took the reins. "Comfortable?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Not even remotely." "Good. Keeps you alert." They rode through terrain that gradually shifted from volcanic wasteland to scrubland to forest. Kaelor set a brutal pace, stopping only when the horses needed rest. He never seemed tired. Whatever the tomb had done to him, it had left him with reserves of endurance that bordered on inhuman. On the second night, camped in a clearing beneath stars Selene had never seen before, the king finally asked the question she'd been waiting for. "Why did you touch the seal?" Selene poked at the fire with a stick. "Because I had nothing left to lose. Everyone has something to lose." She looked up at him across the flames. "What did I have? A life scrubbing floors? Years of being told I was worthless? The privilege of dying alone and forgotten in some servant's quarter?" Kaelor's expression softened slightly. "You wanted to matter." "I wanted proof that I existed at all," Selene corrected. "Even if that proof was getting killed by some ancient curse." The king was quiet for a long moment. "I understand that," he said finally. "More than you know. Tell me." He stared into the fire. "When I first took the throne, I was young, and convinced I could fix everything through force of will. Every problem looked like something I could solve by being stronger, smarter, more ruthless than everyone else. What changed? Nothing, for a long time. That was the problem." His voice went flat. "I conquered territories, crushed rebellions, implemented policies that looked brilliant on paper and destroyed lives in practice. And the whole time I told myself I was building something great." "Were you?" Kaelor's laugh was bitter. "I was building a prison. A beautiful, efficient prison where everyone had a place and no one could escape. The Dominion Council wasn't wrong to stop me. I'd become exactly what they accused me of. A monster. A king who forgot that crowns are supposed to protect people, not control them." He finally looked at her. "The imprisonment was mercy. I just couldn't see it at the time." Selene absorbed this. "And now? Now I'm trying to figure out if I've learned anything in 200 years, or if I'm about to make all the same mistakes with a new coat of paint." The honesty startled her. She'd expected arrogance, certainty, the absolute confidence of an alpha who'd never questioned his right to rule. Instead, she was seeing something more dangerous. Self-awareness combined with power. "Do you regret it?" she asked, coming back. "Every second." His silver eyes met hers. "But I'd do it again anyway." "Why?" "Because someone needs to stop the Dominion from doing to others what they did to you. And because," he added quietly, "fate gave me 200 years to think about what really matters. I'm not wasting the chance to get it right this time." They rode into Moonspire Keep on the 3rd day, and Selene understood immediately why it had been the heart of his empire. The fortress stood carved into a mountain face, massive towers of dark stone that seemed to grow from the rock itself. Even in ruins, even with sections collapsed and walls crumbling, it radiated the kind of power that made civilizations remember why they feared certain places. Kaelor stopped his horse at the main gate, his expression unreadable. "I thought it would feel different," he said quietly. "Coming home." "How does it feel?" "Like visiting a grave." They dismounted and entered through gates that hung crooked on broken hinges. The courtyard beyond stretched empty and silent, weeds growing through cracked stone. Evidence of the final battle that had ended his reign remained everywhere, Scorch marks on walls, dried blood in the cracks between flagstones, weapons embedded in wood and stone where they'd been left 2 centuries ago. Selene followed as Kaelor walked through his destroyed empire. He didn't speak, just moved from room to room with the careful attention of someone cataloging damage. The throne room, the war council chamber, living quarters where personal items still sat on shelves thick with dust. In what had been his private quarters, Kaelor stopped in front of a mirror tall as a man. The glass was cracked but still reflective, showing his image fractured into pieces. "I used to stand here before battles," he said, "convincing myself I was making the right choices, that the ends justified the means, that history would remember me as great instead of terrible." "What does history remember?" Selene asked. "Nothing. The Dominion erased me completely." He touched the cracked glass. "Maybe that's better than the truth." A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the keep. Footsteps on stone. Kaelor's hand went to his sword immediately. "Stay behind me," he ordered. But when the figure emerged from the shadows, it was an old man with white hair and tears streaming down his weathered face. "My king," the man whispered, falling to his knees. "You've returned." More figures appeared, men and women ranging from elderly to young adults who'd been children when Kaelor was imprisoned. They emerged from hidden passages and sealed rooms, loyalists who'd been waiting 200 years for permission to hope. They knelt before their king in the ruins of his empire, and Selene watched Kaelor's face as he realized he wasn't alone after all. "Rise," he said roughly. "All of you. How many are here?" 43, the old man said. "All that's left of the original garrison's bloodlines. We've kept the fortress protected, kept the old ways alive, waited for the prophecy to fulfill itself." "What prophecy?" The old man's eyes shifted to Selene. "The one that said you'd return with the White Wolf Queen when the Empire needed salvation most." Selene felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The weight of expectation was crushing. "I'm not a queen," she said. "I don't even have a wolf." The old man smiled. "Not yet. But the prophecy is never wrong." "What happens if it is?" Selene demanded. "What happens if I'm just some cursed servant who happened to be in the wrong place?" "Then we adapt," Kaelor said firmly. "Prophecies are useful for morale, but wars are won by steel and strategy, not fate." The Loyalists began organizing immediately. Rooms were cleared and cleaned, supplies brought out of hidden caches. A war council formed from the old families who'd kept the resistance alive for generations. Selene found herself swept into preparations she didn't understand. Someone gave her proper clothes, leather and dark fabric meant for movement instead of servitude. Someone else started teaching her basic combat forms. Everything moved too fast. That night, she found Kaelor on the fortress walls, staring out over the dark valleys below. "I don't know if I can do this," she said quietly. "Neither do I." He didn't look at her. "But we don't have much choice." "There's always a choice." "Fine." His voice turned hard. "Choose. Go back to the Citadel and beg the Council for mercy. They'll probably torture you for information about me, then kill you publicly to prove they're still in control, or stay here and learn to survive what comes next. Those aren't real choices." "No," Kaelor agreed. "They're not. That's what power does. It eliminates all the comfortable options until only the terrible ones remain." Selene moved to stand beside him. The wind up here was bitter cold, carrying the scent of distant forests and older things. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Do you think we can actually win?" The king was silent for a long time. Then, "I think we can hurt them badly enough that they'll never feel completely safe again. Beyond that, it depends on how many people are desperate enough to risk everything for change. And if we fail, then we die, and the Dominion continues grinding souls into dust for another 2 centuries. His hand found hers on the cold stone. "But at least we'll die fighting instead of kneeling." Selene thought about the scarred guard's sister, about all the invisible lives crushed beneath systems designed to keep certain people broken, about what it meant to actually matter instead of just existing. "Teach me," she said finally. "Everything you know about survival, about war, about being something other than prey." Kaelor looked at her then, silver eyes reflecting starlight. "It won't be gentle." "Good. I'm tired of gentle." The king smiled that dangerous smile, and Selene felt something shift between them. Not attraction exactly, something deeper. The recognition of two damaged souls who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided broken was better than nothing. Training started before dawn. Kaelor was a brutal instructor, all efficiency and no mercy. He taught her how to move, how to fall, how to read an opponent's intentions in their shoulders and eyes, how to use momentum instead of strength, how to turn survival instincts into tactical advantages. Selene failed constantly. She got knocked down, winded, bruised until her body was a map of violence. But she kept getting up. The king was right. It wasn't gentle. It was exactly what she needed. Between training sessions, she sat in on war councils. The Loyalists had maintained intelligence networks across the kingdom, feeding information about the Dominion's movements and the state of the outer provinces. The picture that emerged was worse than even Kaelor had expected. Entire bloodlines disappeared. An old woman named Mara reported. Suspected dissidents. Their families. Anyone who questioned policy too loudly. What about the military, Kaelor asked, stretched thin. The Dominion maintains 3 major standing armies, but recruitment is down. Too many young wolves dying in conscription. Good. The king's expression was calculating. Fear keeps them in line, but resentment builds armies. How many provinces would side with us openly? None at first, Mara said honestly. But if you proved you could actually win, half the kingdom would rise overnight. So we need a victory. Kaelor looked at his assembled loyalists. Something public. Something that proves the Dominion isn't invincible. The table fell silent. Everyone knew what he was asking. A direct attack on council assets would provoke full retaliation. There's a weapons convoy, someone said finally, scheduled to move through the Thornwood Pass in 6 days. Heavily guarded, meant to supply the northern garrison. How many guards? Kaelor asked. 50 soldiers, 20 mounted, plus battle mages. The king smiled. Perfect. That's suicide, Mara said flatly. It's a statement. Kaelor's eyes gleamed. The Dominion can't protect its own supply lines. Every province will hear about it. Every conscript will start wondering if maybe the council isn't as strong as they claim. And if we lose, then we were always going to lose. Might as well make it memorable. Selene watched him work, mapping strategies and assigning roles with the easy confidence of someone who'd commanded armies before. This was what he'd been built for. Not politics, not ceremony. War. And she was starting to understand that maybe she'd been built for it too. The convoy attack was scheduled for dawn on the 6th day. Kaelor spent the intervening time drilling his small force mercilessly. 43 loyalists against 50 trained soldiers. The odds were terrible, which meant they'd have to be better. On the night before the attack, Selene found herself unable to sleep. She wandered the fortress until she found Kaelor in the armory, sharpening blades by candlelight. You should rest, he said without looking up. So should you. Can't. Too much to think about. Selene sat across from him. Are you scared? Terrified. He tested the edge of a knife against his thumb. But fear is useful, keeps you sharp. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just the sound of steel on whetstone. Why did you really agree to teach me? Selene asked eventually. You could have left me behind, protected, out of danger. Because protected things are targets, Kaelor said. And I've seen what happens to queens who can't defend themselves. The Empire eats them alive. Is that what happened to your first queen? His hand stilled on the blade. I never had one. The council imprisoned me before I could take a mate. Then you don't actually know if the bond between us is real or just convenient. The king finally looked up, silver eyes serious. The bond is real. I can feel it every time you're near. Like recognition deeper than thought. But you're right that I don't know what it means beyond biology. What if it's not enough? Selene's voice came out smaller than intended. What if we're bound by fate, but incompatible in every way that matters? Then we'll fail together instead of separately. He went back to sharpening. At least that way, neither of us dies alone. The attack went wrong immediately. The intelligence about the convoy was solid, but what the scouts hadn't reported was the additional 30 soldiers who'd joined as reinforcements. 80 armed warriors against 43 rebels who'd trained for less than a week. Kaelor called the retreat within seconds of realizing they were outmatched. But the Dominion soldiers were already in position, cutting off escape routes. The ambush became a slaughter. Selene watched loyalists die. People she'd only known for days, but who'd welcomed her with desperate hope. Watched Kaelor fight like something feral and magnificent, his black wolf tearing through enemies even as wounds accumulated across his body. And she felt something crack open inside her chest. Not fear, not grief. Rage. The same rage that had flickered when she first touched the seal, when she learned her entire life had been a curse, when she realized the Dominion had systematically destroyed her bloodline just to keep her powerless. Silver fire erupted from her skin. The curse shattered, and Selene's wolf finally woke up. The transformation tore through her like lightning, violent and absolute, and nothing like she'd imagined. Pain beyond description as bones reformed and muscle rebuilt. But underneath the agony was something else. Recognition. This was who she'd always been. This power had been sleeping in her blood for 22 years, waiting for rage strong enough to break through centuries of curse work. When the white wolf stood where Selene had been, every warrior on the battlefield stopped moving. She was massive, larger than Kaelor, larger than should have been possible. Her coat shone silver white like moonlight made solid, and her eyes burned with ancient power. The kind of power that made even alphas instinctively bow. Kaelor shifted back to human form, staring at her with something between wonder and terror. "Run," he ordered the loyalists who could still move. "Get back to Moonspire. Now!" They scattered into the forest. The Dominion soldiers were slower to respond. Some tried to attack. Most just stood frozen as the White Wolf Queen stepped toward them with predatory grace. Selene didn't think, didn't plan, just let instinct take over. The battle that followed would be remembered in whispered stories for generations. The White Wolf moving through soldiers like death itself, efficient and unstoppable. The Black Wolf fighting beside her, two predators perfectly synchronized. When it was over, 80 soldiers lay dead in the Thornwood Pass, and the kingdom would never be the same. They made it back to Moonspire Keep covered in blood and glory, and the terrible knowledge that there was no going back now. The Dominion would retaliate with everything they had. Civil war was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Kaelor found Selene in her quarters, still shaking from the transformation. She'd shifted back to human form hours ago, but could still feel the wolf coiled inside her, awake and aware and waiting. "So," the king said from the doorway, "royal bloodline confirmed." Selene looked up at him. Her hands were covered in blood she couldn't quite remember spilling. "I killed people today. You saved people today. There's a difference." "Is there?" She'd spent 22 years being powerless. The sudden rush of being able to hurt back was intoxicating and terrifying. Kaelor moved into the room, sitting on the floor beside her. "Yes, but it's easy to forget. That's how monsters are made. Am I a monster now? Ask me again after you've had time to process what happened. Right now, you're in shock." They sat together in silence, two souls covered in the evidence of what they'd become. "The council will come for us with everything," Selene said finally. "Probably. We can't win a straight fight against 3 armies." "No. So what do we do?" The king smiled that dangerous smile. "We make them fight each other." Over the next weeks, Kaelor proved why he'd once built an empire. Intelligence networks activated, supply lines disrupted. Propaganda spread through taverns and military camps about the Alpha King, who'd returned with his White Wolf Queen to save the kingdom from tyranny. The Dominion responded with mass executions. Entire villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. The capital became a fortress preparing for siege. And through it all, Selene trained. Not just combat now, but politics, strategy, the brutal calculations of leadership. Kaelor taught her everything he knew, holding nothing back. How to read battlefield reports. How to inspire loyalty. How to make the terrible choices that kept people alive even when it cost others everything. Their bond deepened through sleepless nights of war planning and quiet moments where two damaged souls recognized themselves in each other. But there was tension too. Fundamental disagreements about mercy and leadership. The king believed peace only existed when enemies feared the consequences of disobedience. Selene believed fear eventually turned everyone into enemies. They fought constantly. Screaming matches that ended with both of them furious and exhausted and still somehow understanding each other better than before. One night, after a particularly brutal argument about whether to execute captured Dominion officers, Kaelor found her on the fortress walls. I know you think I'm too ruthless, he said without preamble. You are too ruthless. Maybe. He stared out over the dark valleys. But I've seen what happens when rulers prioritize being loved over being effective. The empire eats them alive. There's a middle ground between loved and feared. Is there? His voice held genuine curiosity. Show me. Selene thought about it. The scarred guard who'd unlocked her chains because it was her choice. The loyalists who'd waited 2 centuries for someone to give them hope. The difference between commanding obedience and earning loyalty. Fear makes soldiers, she said finally. Trust makes warriors willing to die for something they believe in. And when trust fails, then you haven't earned it properly. Kaelor laughed, surprised. 200 years of thinking, and I never quite framed it that way. Maybe that's why fate bound us. Maybe. He looked at her then, silver eyes reflecting starlight. Or maybe fate just has a twisted sense of humor. 3 months after the convoy attack, scouts reported movement from the capital. The Dominion had finally assembled their response. 3 armies marching toward Moonspire Keep from different directions. 15,000 soldiers total, against 43 loyalists and whatever scattered rebels they could rally. The War Council fell silent when Kaelor presented the numbers. We can't win this, Mara said flatly. Not conventionally, Kaelor agreed. So we don't fight conventionally. He outlined a plan so audacious it bordered on insane. Instead of defending Moonspire, they'd abandon it. Let the Dominion armies converge on an empty fortress while the rebellion struck directly at the capital during the Eclipse Festival when nobles would be vulnerable and distracted. It was suicide. It was also their only chance. The night before they left Moonspire for the last time, Selene found Kaelor in his old quarters, packing artifacts and documents into traveling cases. Taking memories with you? She asked. Evidence. His voice was cold. When this is over, I want the kingdom to understand exactly what the Dominion did while ruling in my name. You're that confident we'll win? I'm that confident we'll make them remember us. Selene moved into the room. They'd spent 3 months fighting beside each other, training together, arguing about the future of an empire neither of them were sure they'd survive to rule. But they'd never actually talked about what happened after. If we somehow win, she said carefully, what comes next? Kaelor stopped packing. Honestly, I don't know. Building is harder than destroying. Governing is harder than conquering. I failed at it once already. You were alone then. Was I? He turned to face her. I had advisors, commanders, an entire empire at my disposal, but no one to stop you from becoming a monster. The words hung between them. Is that what you think you are? Selene asked. My leash? The king's expression turned complicated. I think we're each other's anchors. You keep me from sliding into the brutality I'm comfortable with. I keep you from hesitating when hard choices need to be made. Sounds exhausting. It is, he smiled slightly. But it works. They left Moonspire Keep at dawn with 200 rebels who'd joined the cause. Not an army, barely a raid force, but enough to be dangerous if deployed correctly. The march toward the capital took 5 days through hostile territory. They moved fast and quiet, avoiding patrols and gathering intelligence about the Eclipse Festival preparations. The capital city of Nocturne sprawled across a valley like a predator at rest. Massive walls, guard towers every 50 feet. The Dominion had transformed it into a fortress designed to survive sieges that could last years. Kaelor studied it from a cliff overlook, his expression unreadable. I built those walls, he said quietly. Thought I was protecting the Empire. Instead, I just made a better prison. Selene stood beside him. Maybe we're both here to tear down what we helped create. The Eclipse Festival began at sunset. Nobles packed the throne cathedral in their finest clothes, celebrating another year of Dominion prosperity while the outer provinces starved. Crystal chandeliers, orchestras, feasts that could have fed entire villages. The rebels moved through sewers beneath the city, emerging inside the castle grounds just as the blood moon eclipse began. Chaos erupted, fire and smoke, screaming nobles, guards scrambling to defend against attacks from inside the supposedly impregnable fortress. The cathedral bells rang in desperate alarm as Kaelor's forces fought through corridors toward the throne room. Inside the throne cathedral, the 5 Dominion Council members waited, surrounded by battle mages and elite guards. Lord Malrek stood at the center, looking exactly as arrogant as Selene remembered from the day he'd sentenced her to death. "The defective one," he said when he saw her. "You survived longer than expected." Selene said nothing. Just let her white wolf tear free, the transformation no longer painful but powerful and complete. Malrek's smile faltered. Kaelor shifted beside her, the black wolf matching her stride for stride as they advanced. The final battle exploded across the cathedral. Stone shattered. Magic cracked through the air. Warriors clashed in savage combat while stained glass windows burst from the pressure of unleashed power. And through it all, Selene fought beside Kaelor in perfect synchronization, shadow and silver, violence and purpose. Two souls who'd found each other in darkness and chosen to burn together. But Malrek had prepared his final weapon. A ritual circle carved into the cathedral floor, designed to consume the entire capital and transfer its life force into himself. If he couldn't rule the empire, no one would. Kaelor saw it first, saw the trap they'd walked into, saw the choice crystallizing with brutal clarity. Someone had to absorb the cursed power destroying the city from within. He moved toward the ritual circle without hesitation, and Selene understood in that moment exactly what he was planning. The same thing he'd always planned, to sacrifice himself so the empire could survive. Because that's what kings did when they finally learned the true price of crowns. She shifted back to human form and grabbed his arm before he could reach the circle. "No," she said. The king met her eyes. "There's no other way. Then we find one together." Selene pulled him close and opened their mate bond completely, merging their powers through the connection fate had forged across 2 centuries. Their combined force erupted in a blinding explosion of silver and black flame that tore through the cathedral. The ritual shattered, Malrek screamed, and the Dominion Council fell. When the dust settled and dawn rose over a wounded but liberated capital, Selene and Kaelor stood among the ruins of an empire transformed. Nobles kneeled, soldiers surrendered. The old order collapsed under the weight of everything it had become. They ascended the throne not as conquerors, but as rulers who'd survived hell together and chosen each other when the world gave them every reason not to. The White Wolf Queen and the Shadow King. Fate's answer to 2 centuries of tyranny, and the story had only just begun. The throne room stank of blood and broken promises. Selene stood beside Kaelor amid the wreckage of the Dominion Council, her white wolf form still humming beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. The ritual circle Malrek had carved into the cathedral floor was nothing but scorched stone now, the cursed magic torn apart by their combined power. But the cost of that victory sat heavy in her chest, making every breath feel like swallowing glass. Around them, surviving nobles knelt in pools of their own terror. Some wept. Others just stared at the floor with the hollow expression of people watching their entire world collapse. Elite guards who'd survived the battle stood frozen against the walls, weapons lowered, waiting to see if they'd live past dawn. The silence stretched until it became suffocating. Kaelor shifted back to human form, standing naked and unconcerned among the bodies of council members who'd ruled for 2 centuries. Someone handed him a cloak, but he just draped it over one shoulder, his attention fixed on the kneeling nobles. "This is what you need to understand about ruling through fear. It works perfectly until the moment it doesn't. Then everyone who pretended to love you reveals they were just waiting for permission to stop pretending." He walked through the throne room like he owned every molecule of air, his silver eyes cataloging faces and storing grudges for later collection. "Lord Veyr," he said, stopping in front of a middle-aged man whose expensive robes were stained with wine and panic. "You were the one who suggested selling Omega children to pay military debts, weren't you?" The noble's face went gray. "My lord, I was following council directives. I never personally—" Kaelor's hand shot out and grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground with inhuman strength. The casual violence of it made several nobles gasp. "Don't insult me with cowardice dressed as obedience," the king said quietly. "You made choices. Own them." He dropped Veyr, who collapsed choking. Selene watched this display with complicated emotions churning through her gut. Part of her wanted to stop him. The rational part that understood mercy was how you built loyalty instead of just transferring fear from one ruler to another. But another part of her, the part that remembered 6 years of scrubbing floors while nobles feasted, wanted to watch him burn the entire aristocracy to ash. That tension between instinct and principle was going to define everything that came next. Kaelor turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying that particular alpha resonance that made even other alphas want to submit. Here's what happens now. Every noble family will submit to a full audit of their holdings and taxation records. Anyone caught profiting from blood laws, child conscription, or debt servitude answers to the crown personally. Anyone who tries to run gets hunted down and made an example. What about those who cooperate? Someone asked from the back. The king's smile was all edges. You get to keep breathing. Don't expect gratitude. A woman stepped forward then, older and sharp-eyed, wearing the insignia of House Marek. And what makes you think we'll simply accept your authority? You've been dead for 2 centuries. The kingdom doesn't need another tyrant wearing a different face. Kaelor studied her with something that might have been respect. What's your name? Lady Tessia Marek. And I remember the stories about your first reign. The purges, the forced breeding programs, the villages burned for rebellion. You were a monster then. What's different now besides the woman standing beside you? The question landed like a blade between ribs. Selene felt every eye shift to her, felt the weight of being used as justification before she'd even agreed to the role. The White Wolf Queen. The balance that supposedly kept the Shadow King from sliding back into brutality. Except she didn't know if that was true or just a convenient story people told themselves to sleep better. What's different, Kaelor said slowly, is that I spent 200 years conscious in that tomb. Every moment, every year. Unable to move or speak or do anything except think about the empire I built and the monster I became building it. He moved closer to Lady Tessia, but there was no threat in the gesture. Just exhaustion. You're right to fear me. You'd be stupid not to. But here's what you need to understand. I've already lived through the version where I rule through domination alone. I know exactly where that path ends. So this time, I'm trying something different, which is learning to share power with someone strong enough to tell me no. He glanced back at Selene, and the look in his eyes was complicated. Not love exactly. Something raw. Recognition of another damaged soul who understood what it cost to survive. Lady Tessia followed his gaze. And if the White Wolf Queen decides your methods are too brutal, if she walks away, then the kingdom gets what it deserves, Kaelor said flatly. Another tyrant. But at least this time you'll know I tried. The brutal honesty of it silenced the room, because that's what nobody wanted to acknowledge. The real danger wasn't that Kaelor would become a monster again. It was that he knew exactly how easy that transformation would be. And the only thing standing between him and that inevitability was a woman who'd been powerless her entire life until 3 months ago. The weight of that responsibility made Selene want to scream. The first war council in the liberated capital happened at midnight in what used to be the Dominion's private strategy room. Maps covered every wall, marked with troop movements and supply routes, and the locations of 3 armies that were still marching toward Moonspire Keep, unaware their masters were dead. Kaelor stood at the head of the table, looking more like a general than a king. Around him sat the surviving loyalists from Moonspire, a handful of rebel commanders who'd joined the cause, and 3 nobles who'd betrayed the Dominion during the final battle. Lady Tessia was there too, representing the aristocracy that hadn't quite decided if this new regime was better or just different. We have maybe 48 hours before those armies realize what happened here, Kaelor said without preamble. After that, we're looking at 15,000 confused and angry soldiers who just lost their command structure. Do we try to intercept them? Asked Mara, the old loyalist who'd kept Moonspire alive for centuries. No. The king traced a line on the map. We send fast riders with proof of the Dominion's fall and an offer. Stand down peacefully and keep your rank under the new regime. Resist and die. That's too generous, someone muttered. Kaelor's eyes went cold. It's practical. We don't have the forces to fight 3 armies simultaneously, and I'm not stupid enough to turn 15,000 soldiers into permanent enemies when I can convert them into reluctant allies. What about the provinces? Lady Tessia asked. They've been bleeding under Dominion taxes for generations. The moment word spreads that the council is dead, you're going to have riots and revenge killings across the kingdom. Good, Kaelor said. Let them burn the tax collectors and corrupt governors. Makes my job easier. You can't just unleash chaos and call it liberation. Watch me. The tension in the room spiked. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. suddenly remembering why people had imprisoned this man in the first place. Selene spoke for the first time. He's right. Everyone turned to stare at her. Not about the chaos part, she clarified. About the provinces. They've earned the right to be angry, but uncontrolled violence just creates new cycles of revenge. We need to channel that rage into reconstruction. How? Kaelor asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. Selene moved to the map, pointing at the outer territories. Send representatives from the new regime, not soldiers. People who actually understand what these provinces have suffered. Offer them real autonomy instead of just new masters. Prove the empire under our rule will be different from what came before. That requires trusting provincial leaders not to use that autonomy to rebel, Lady Tessia pointed out. Yes, Selene agreed. It does. The king studied her across the table. You're asking me to bet the stability of the entire kingdom on people's better nature? I'm asking you to remember that fear only works until it doesn't. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something fundamental. The first real disagreement between the Shadow King and the White Wolf Queen about how to wield power. Kaelor's jaw tightened. Fine, send your representatives. But the moment any province uses that autonomy to restart the blood laws or debt servitude, I burn it to the ground personally. Fair enough. The meeting continued for 3 more hours, dissecting logistics and resources and the 1,000 practical nightmares of holding together an empire mid-collapse. By the time it ended, Selene's head pounded and her eyes burned from staring at maps under candlelight. She found Kaelor afterward on the cathedral balcony, staring out over the capital as dawn broke across stone and steel. You undermined me in there, he said without turning around. Good. That's literally my job. He laughed, sharp and bitter. Most queens would wait until private to disagree with their king. Most queens weren't cursed servants until 3 months ago. Selene moved to stand beside him. Besides, if I only challenge you in private, everyone assumes I'm just decorative. This way they know I'm actually paying attention. The king glanced at her. You're learning politics fast. I had good teachers. 6 years of watching nobles pretend servants don't exist teaches you a lot about power games. They stood together watching the city wake up. Smoke still rose from buildings that had burned during the battle. Bodies were still being cleared from the streets. The work of reconstruction would take years, if it even worked at all. Do you think we can actually pull this off? Selene asked quietly. Building something better instead of just tearing down what existed? Kaelor was silent for a long time. Honestly, I have no idea. Every instinct I have says rule through strength, crush opposition before it organizes, make examples brutal enough that nobody dares challenge you. But that's what created the Dominion in the first place. He turned to face her fully. So I'm trying to trust that maybe fate bound us together, because you can see paths I can't. Ways to build power that don't require grinding souls into dust. The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. This was the Alpha King who'd conquered territories and commanded armies, and he was admitting he didn't have all the answers. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it was terrifying, because if he was looking to her for moral guidance, they were both more lost than either of them wanted to admit. The first execution happened on the 3rd day. A provincial governor caught trying to flee the capital with chests full of gold extracted through illegal taxes and forced labor. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses lined up dozens deep. The man had personally ordered children conscripted to pay their parents' fabricated debts. Kaelor held the trial in the throne cathedral, open to anyone who wanted to attend. Hundreds packed the space, mostly common people who'd never been allowed inside before. Selene stood beside the throne, her white wolf form simmering just beneath her skin. She'd learned to hold the transformation in that middle state, powerful enough to feel but controlled enough to remain human. It made her eyes shine silver and her presence radiate dominance. The governor knelt in chains while witness after witness described atrocities. A mother whose 8-year-old daughter had been conscripted. A farmer whose entire crop was seized as taxation for a war that never benefited his province. An Omega woman branded defective and sold to pay her family's debt. By the time the testimonies finished, Selene's hands were shaking with rage. The king's verdict was simple. Death by beheading, public, immediate. No one in the cathedral disagreed. They dragged the governor outside to a courtyard where an executioner's block had been prepared. Thousands gathered to watch. Some cheered. Others just stood silent, bearing witness to something that felt like justice but tasted like revenge. Kaelor performed the execution himself. One clean strike that severed the governor's head and sent it rolling across the stones. The crowd erupted, some in celebration, some in horror, all of them understanding that the new regime would be just as brutal as the old one when it came to punishment. Selene watched from the balcony above and felt something cold settle in her chest. This was the cost of ruling, not just making hard decisions, but becoming comfortable with violence as a tool of governance. And the worst part was understanding that Kaelor was right. The governor deserved death. The evidence was clear, the crimes were unforgivable. But where was the line between justice and tyranny? How many executions before they stopped being necessary and started being convenient? She found the king in his quarters afterward, washing blood from his hands in a basin. That was brutal, she said. It was necessary. Was it? Or did you just enjoy it? Kaelor looked up sharply. You think I enjoyed beheading a man in front of thousands of witnesses? I think part of you did. The part that remembers being powerful enough that fear alone kept people in line. He dried his hands slowly. You're not wrong. There's something intoxicating about absolute authority, about making a decision and watching the entire world rearrange itself to accommodate your will. That's what scares me. Good. The king's eyes met hers. It should scare you. It scares me too. That's why I need you to keep calling it out. Selene moved closer. And what happens when calling it out isn't enough? When you decide my objections are inconvenient and start ignoring them? Then you do what fate designed you to do. He gestured at her, at the silver fire still humming beneath her skin. You remind me that I'm not the only predator in this empire anymore. The challenge in his voice was clear. He wasn't asking her to be a moderating influence through gentle persuasion. He was asking her to be a threat, an equal power capable of checking his worst impulses through force if necessary. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her, and it made the weight of the crown feel even heavier. The riders sent to intercept the 3 armies returned on the 7th day with mixed results. 2 armies had stood down after their commanders reviewed the evidence of the Dominion's fall. They'd agreed to return to their garrisons and await new orders from the throne. The 3rd Army, under General Kress, had executed the riders and declared themselves independent. They were marching on the capital to restore what they called legitimate rule. 5,000 soldiers, battle-hardened, loyal to the old regime. The War Council reconvened immediately. General Kress was always the fanatic, Mara said grimly. He built his entire career on Dominion policies. This isn't about loyalty to the Council. It's about protecting his own power base. Can we negotiate? Lady Tessia asked. Kaelor shook his head. I know Kress. He'd rather burn the kingdom than admit he backed the wrong side. Negotiation just gives him time to fortify positions. So we fight, one of the rebel commanders said. Against 5,000 professional soldiers, we'd lose half our forces in the first engagement. The room fell into tense silence. They'd won the throne through surprise and tactical superiority, but in a straight battle against a trained army, the outcome was far from certain. Selene studied the map, an idea forming that made her stomach turn. There's another option. Everyone looked at her. We don't fight them, she said slowly. We break them from inside. How? The same way the Dominion broke us. Psychological warfare. Kress's army isn't one unified force. It's made up of conscripts from a dozen different provinces, most of whom were forced into service. If we can make them believe the regime they're dying for is already dead, they'll fracture. That's manipulation, Lady Tessia said carefully. Yes, Selene agreed. It is. Kaelor's expression turned calculating. You want to send infiltrators into their ranks, spread dissent, make them question their leadership until the whole structure collapses. Exactly. The king smiled that dangerous smile. I like it. It's devious and cost-effective, and doesn't require us to slaughter thousands of conscripts who were probably forced into this war in the first place. It also makes us exactly like the Dominion, someone muttered. No, Kaelor said sharply. The Dominion used manipulation to maintain oppression. We're using it to prevent a bloodbath. There's a difference. Is there? Selene asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Because that was the real test, wasn't it? Whether they could use the same tools as their enemies without becoming them. Whether the methods mattered less than the goals. Selene wasn't sure she believed that, but she also wasn't sure they had a choice. The infiltration operation took 3 days to prepare. Former conscripts who'd joined the rebellion volunteered to return to Cress's army as supposed deserters from the new regime. They carried stories about chaos in the capital, about the White Wolf Queen executing nobles indiscriminately, about Kaelor being even more brutal than the Dominion. All lies designed to make soldiers question whether they were fighting for liberation or just new masters. Selene helped craft the propaganda personally, each word carefully chosen to exploit fears and resentments. It felt like swallowing poison, using the same techniques that had kept her powerless for years. But it worked. Within days, reports came back about growing dissent in Cress's ranks. Fights breaking out between conscripts and career soldiers. Desertions increasing. The general's authority fraying at the edges. On the 10th day, the army fractured completely. 3,000 soldiers abandoned their posts and either scattered to their home provinces or approached the capital under flags of truce. The remaining 2,000 under Cress's direct command dug into a defensive position outside the city, preparing for a siege they didn't have the resources to sustain. The king gave them one final chance to surrender. Cress responded by executing deserters in view of the capital walls. Kaelor's retaliation was immediate and absolute. He led the assault personally, his black wolf tearing through defensive positions with Selene's white wolf beside him. The battle was brutal and one-sided, more slaughter than combat. By the time the sun set, General Cress was dead and his army was scattered. Victory. But it tasted like ash. Selene found herself in the aftermath, standing amid bodies that looked too young to have been soldiers. Conscripts who'd been fighting for a regime that was already dead. Too terrified of their commanders to desert. Too broken by the system to imagine alternatives. She'd helped kill them through manipulation and violence. The White Wolf Queen, savior of the oppressed. She bent over and vomited into the blood-stained grass. Kaelor found her there, his own body covered in gore and evidence of his capacity for controlled violence. "This is what ruling costs," he said quietly. "You make choices that keep most people alive, and then you live with the weight of everyone who died anyway. How do you bear it? By remembering that the alternative is worse." He crouched beside her. Under the Dominion, these same soldiers would have been marched into another war within months, used as fodder for territorial expansion, or put down if they questioned orders. At least this way, their deaths actually mattered. Selene looked at him. "Do you actually believe that?" "Some days." "And the others?" "Other days I wonder if I'm just a monster with better justification." The honesty was devastating. Because that was the thing about Kaelor. He wasn't a villain who thought he was right. He was a broken king who understood exactly how terrible his choices were and made them anyway because the alternatives looked worse. And Selene was starting to realize she was becoming the same. The reconstruction of the empire began in earnest after Cress's army fell. Provincial representatives arrived in the capital, most of them suspicious and angry, all of them desperate for proof that this new regime would actually be different. Kaelor spent endless hours in meetings, negotiating autonomy agreements and resource allocation, and the 1,000 practical details of governance. He was surprisingly good at it when he wasn't defaulting to threats. But the transformation from warlord to administrator was clearly exhausting him. Selene watched him grow more irritable and short-tempered as the weeks passed. Violence had always been his language. Politics required translations he wasn't fluent in. One night she found him in the war room at 3 a.m, surrounded by reports and looking ready to set them all on fire. "You need to sleep," she said. "I need to figure out how to feed 500,000 people before winter. The Dominion's supply lines are a disaster, and most provincial governors were stealing resources for personal profit. So delegate. Find people who actually understand agriculture and logistics. I don't trust people I don't know. Then you'll work yourself to death trying to micromanage an empire." Kaelor slammed his fist on the table hard enough to crack the wood. "This is exactly what destroyed me the first time. Trying to control everything because I didn't trust anyone to care as much as I did." Selene moved around the table to stand beside him. "So learn from it. Build a government that functions without you being the linchpin. And if I build it wrong? If I empower people who use that authority to restart the same oppression? Then we fix it. together. He looked at her with exhaustion and frustration, and something that might have been desperation. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I know how to conquer, how to rule through fear, how to make hard choices that keep the empire intact. But building something sustainable? Something that doesn't require a tyrant at the center? I have no idea where to start." The vulnerability shattered something in Selene's chest. Because she'd been seeing him as this all-powerful alpha king, the predator who'd survived 2 centuries of burial and returned stronger. But underneath that was just a man who'd been shaped by violence and war and the terrible weight of absolute power. He was as lost as she was. "Maybe that's why we're supposed to do this together," she said quietly. "You know what doesn't work from experience. I know what it feels like to be powerless under systems designed to keep people broken. Between us, maybe we can figure out something that's actually sustainable." Kaelor studied her for a long moment. "You have more faith in this than I do. One of us has to." He laughed, tired and raw. "Fair enough." They worked through the night together, building frameworks for provincial governance that balanced autonomy with accountability. It was tedious and complicated, and nothing like the dramatic battles that had brought them to power, but it felt important in a way violence never quite did. Somewhere around dawn, Kaelor reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not letting me slide back into the easy brutality. For pushing me to be better even when I don't want to be." Selene squeezed his fingers. "That's literally why fate bound us together, to keep each other honest. Then fate has a twisted sense of partnership." They sat there as dawn light filtered through the windows, 2 damaged souls trying to build an empire that wouldn't devour them or the people they were supposed to protect. It was the most honest moment they'd shared since the tomb. The formal coronation happened 6 weeks after the Dominion fell. The entire capital turned out for the ceremony, packing the streets and balconies and every available space with a view of the throne cathedral. This time the building had been cleaned and repaired, the blood scrubbed from the floors and the broken stained glass replaced. Selene wore traditional royal regalia that felt like a costume designed for someone else. The crown was too heavy, the ceremonial robes too elaborate. Everything about the pageantry felt performative in ways that made her skin crawl. But she understood the necessity. People needed symbols, needed to believe that authority had transferred legitimately, that the new regime had the backing of tradition and history and whatever legitimacy crowns supposedly carried. So she played the role. Kaelor stood beside her looking every inch the Alpha King, dark and commanding and radiating the kind of power that made even skeptics want to kneel. When the High Priestess placed the crown on his head, the crowd erupted in cheers that shook the cathedral foundations. Then it was Selene's turn. The priestess approached with the smaller crown designed for queens. Silver worked with moonstones that caught the light like captured stars. "Selene Veyr," the woman intoned, "last daughter of the original royal bloodline. Do you accept the responsibility of ruling this empire with wisdom, compassion, and strength?" The question felt loaded with implications Selene didn't fully understand, but she'd come too far to hesitate now. "I do," she said clearly. The crown settled on her head, and the weight of it was immediate and crushing. Not the physical weight, but the metaphorical one. Every person in the empire looking to her and Kaelor to fix generations of systemic damage. The responsibility was suffocating. When the ceremony ended and they emerged onto the cathedral balcony to address the crowd, Selene felt Kaelor's hand find hers beneath the formal robes. The gesture was hidden from view, but the meaning was clear. "We're in this together, for better or worse." The speech Kaelor gave was surprisingly restrained. No grand promises about immediate prosperity or perfect justice. Just an acknowledgement that the empire was broken and rebuilding would take years of hard work and painful choices. The crowd seemed to appreciate the honesty. When it was Selene's turn to speak, she looked out over thousands of faces and saw herself reflected back. The servants and laborers and forgotten people who'd survived under systems designed to keep them powerless. "I was one of you," she said simply. 6 weeks ago, I was scrubbing floors in this citadel, branded defective, told my entire life I was worthless. The only reason I'm standing here is because the Dominion made a mistake when they sent me to die. The crowd fell silent. "I can't promise you the new empire will be perfect. I can't promise we won't make mistakes or that transformation will happen overnight. But I can promise you this: never again will your voices be ignored, Never again will your lives be treated as expendable. And if we fail to uphold that promise, you have my permission to tear this throne down and build something better." The words landed like a declaration of war against the old order. And the crowd's response was deafening. The first real crisis of the new regime came 3 months into Reconstruction. A province in the Northern Territories declared independence, citing the autonomy agreements as justification. They weren't restarting blood laws or debt servitude. They just wanted complete separation from the empire that had bled them dry for generations. The War Council was divided. Half argued for immediate military intervention to prevent other provinces from getting similar ideas. The other half insisted that using force would make them exactly like the Dominion. Kaelor sat at the head of the table, listening to both sides with an expression that gave away nothing. Finally, he turned to Selene. "What do you think?" She'd been dreading this question, because there was no good answer. Letting one province secede might fracture the entire empire, but forcing them to stay through military action betrayed everything they'd promised about autonomy and choice. "I think we should let them go," she said finally. The table erupted in arguments. Kaelor raised his hand and silence fell immediately. "Explain. If we force them to stay, we prove that autonomy was always conditional, that we're just the Dominion with different faces." Selene met his eyes across the table. "But if we let them leave peacefully and wish them well, we prove our promises meant something. Other provinces might choose to stay because they actually want to, not because they're terrified of the alternative." "That's idealistic nonsense," one commander said flatly. "Empires don't survive through kindness." "Maybe that's the problem," Selene shot back. "Maybe empires that only survive through force deserve to fall." The tension in the room spiked dangerously. Kaelor studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled that dangerous smile, and Selene knew she'd either won him over or pushed too far. "We let them go," the king announced. "Send a delegation with trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. Make it clear they're welcome to return if they change their minds, but we're not going to punish them for choosing independence." "My lord, that's the decision," Kaelor cut off the objection. "And if other provinces want to secede, we'll handle those situations individually. But we're not building this empire through conquest and fear. Not again." The commander's jaw tightened, but he nodded. After the meeting, Selene found Kaelor on the walls overlooking the city. "That was a risk," she said. "Everything about this is a risk." He didn't look at her. "But you were right. If we can't trust provinces to choose staying over leaving, then we haven't actually built anything worth preserving. You're learning. Or I'm getting soft in my old age." Selene moved to stand beside him. 237 isn't that old. For an Alpha King, it's ancient. He finally glanced at her. "Most of us burn out by 50. Too much violence and too many hard choices until there's nothing left but the monster." "Is that what you're afraid of? Burning out?" "I'm afraid of waking up one day and realizing I've become exactly what I was before the imprisonment, just with better justification and a mate who thinks she can save me from myself." The bitterness in his voice was cutting. "I don't think I can save you," Selene said carefully. "I think we can save each other." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Because I'm just as capable of becoming a monster as you are. I felt it. The rage that makes violence feel justified. The certainty that my suffering gives me the right to make others suffer." Kaelor turned to face her fully. "What stops you?" "Remembering what it felt like to be powerless. Knowing that every decision we make creates someone else's reality." She held his gaze. "And you? Watching you fight so hard to be better than your worst instincts reminds me to fight too." The king's expression softened slightly. "We're quite the pair. Two broken predators trying not to devour the kingdom we're supposed to protect. Could be worse." "How?" "We could be doing this alone." The first winter under the new regime was brutal. Crop failures in 3 provinces due to years of Dominion overtaxation depleting the soil. A plague outbreak in the Southern Territories. Supply chain collapse from dismantling corrupt governors without having replacements ready. The empire teetered on the edge of famine and chaos. Kaelor worked himself to exhaustion trying to coordinate relief efforts. Selene found herself managing refugee camps and negotiating with merchant guilds for emergency grain shipments. Neither of them slept more than 4 hours a night. The stress brought out the worst in both of them. They fought constantly. Sharp arguments that started over logistics and escalated into fundamental disagreements about governance and power and whose approach was actually working. One night it exploded into full confrontation. "You're too soft," Kaelor snarled after Selene vetoed his plan to seize merchant grain stores by force. "People are starving, and you want to negotiate politely with profiteers? I want to build systems that don't require tyranny to function. Systems take time we don't have. Children are dying right now, and seizing supplies at sword point just teaches everyone that might makes right. We'll be back to Dominion policies within a year." Better than mass starvation. Selene's wolf surged beneath her skin, silver fire crackling in her eyes. "You don't actually believe that. Don't tell me what I believe." "Fine. Then I'll tell you what I see. A king who's terrified that trying something different will fail, so he's looking for excuses to default to the violence he's comfortable with." The words hit like physical blows. Kaelor's expression went deadly cold. "Get out." "No, I said get out before I do something we'll both regret." Selene stood her ground. "You want to fight me? Go ahead. Prove you're exactly the monster you're so afraid of becoming." His wolf exploded free before she finished the sentence. The black wolf was massive and furious, all teeth and dominance and rage looking for a target. Every instinct in Selene's body screamed to submit or run. She did neither. Instead, she let her own wolf tear free, the white lunar wolf matching his size and ferocity. They faced each other in the royal quarters, two predators at the breaking point. And then Kaelor shifted back to human form, breathing hard, his expression devastated. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "I'm so sorry. You're right, and I hate it, and I almost—" Selene shifted back, her own hand shaking. "I know, I pushed you on purpose to see if you'd actually hurt me. That's insane, probably. But I needed to know if we'd cross that line, if the bond between us was strong enough to survive our worst moments." "And?" His voice was raw. "You stopped." She moved closer. "Even furious and desperate and convinced I was wrong, you stopped. That's what makes you different from the monster you used to be." Kaelor pulled her into his arms then, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be strong enough to lead and vulnerable enough to actually connect with people. How to make hard choices without becoming numb to the cost. None of us do. That's why it's so hard." They stood there wrapped around each other, two damaged souls who'd found each other in darkness and were trying desperately not to drown each other in the process. It wasn't romance, it was survival. The winter crisis eventually stabilized through a combination of Selene's diplomacy and Kaelor's willingness to make unpopular decisions. They didn't seize merchant supplies, but they did implement emergency taxation on noble houses that had profited under the Dominion. The aristocracy howled about overreach. The common people cheered. By spring, the immediate danger had passed. Crop planting resumed under new agricultural policies. The plague was contained. Refugee camps transitioned into permanent settlements with actual infrastructure. The empire survived its first major test, but the cost was visible in both their faces. Kaelor looked older, the weight of responsibility carving new lines around his eyes. Selene had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her body burning through reserves trying to keep pace with the demands of governance. They were both running on fumes and stubborn determination. Lady Tessia cornered Selene one afternoon in the administrative wing. "You're going to kill yourselves at this pace," the noble said bluntly. "We don't have a choice. There's always a choice." Tessia's expression was complicated. "I've watched you both for 6 months now. You're trying to rebuild an empire through sheer force of will and personal sacrifice. It's not sustainable. What do you suggest?" "Delegate more. Trust the people you've appointed to actually do their jobs. And for the love of everything, take 1 day off before you both collapse." Selene wanted to argue, but she was so tired the words wouldn't come. Tessia softened slightly. "I know you don't trust easily, neither of you, but you've built something worth preserving here. Don't destroy it by working yourselves to death." That night, Selene found Kaelor and made him leave the palace. They rode out to the forest beyond the capital, just the two of them, and spent hours running in wolf form through territory that belonged to no one. The freedom of it was intoxicating after months of being trapped by responsibility. When they finally shifted back and collapsed in a clearing under stars, Kaelor laughed for the first time in weeks. "We're terrible at this," he said. "At what?" "Ruling. Delegating, not micromanaging every detail like control is the only thing keeping the kingdom from falling apart. Selene rolled onto her side to face him. Maybe that's because neither of us has ever been part of something functional. We're both trauma survivors trying to build systems we have no blueprint for. Probably. His silver eyes met hers. But we're still here, still trying. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. They stayed there until dawn, two predators who'd chosen each other when the world gave them every reason not to, remembering why they'd survived this long. The message arrived 3 days later. Scouts from the eastern borderlands reported massive troop movements. An empire Kaelor thought had collapsed during his imprisonment had apparently survived and rebuilt. And now they were marching toward Vaelor with 50,000 soldiers, not to invade, to conquer. The War Council assembled in grim silence as scouts presented their findings. Maps spread across the table showing invasion routes and projected timelines. The news was catastrophic. Emperor Draven leads them personally, a scout reported. He's been consolidating power for decades. Sees Vaelor's current instability as the perfect opportunity for expansion. How long until they reach our borders? Kaelor's voice was deadly calm. 2 months. Maybe less if they force march. The room fell silent. They'd spent 6 months rebuilding from the Dominion's fall. The Empire was still fractured and vulnerable. Fighting a fresh war against a well-organized enemy would destroy everything they'd built. We can't win this, someone said quietly. Kaelor's expression turned to stone. Then we make alliances. Call in every favor. Promise anything necessary to field an army capable of defense. That could take months we don't have. Then we buy time. He looked around the table. Hit their supply lines. Guerrilla warfare. Make every mile they advance cost them enough that they reconsider the invasion. Lady Tessia spoke carefully. You're talking about total war. Scorched earth tactics that will devastate border provinces caught in the crossfire. Better than letting Draven waltz in unopposed. Selene had been silent through the entire briefing. Now she stood, her white wolf stirring beneath her skin. There's another option, she said quietly. Everyone turned to stare. I challenge Emperor Draven directly. Single combat, alpha to alpha, winner takes the disputed territories. The room erupted in objections. Kaelor's voice cut through the chaos. No, absolutely not. Selene met his eyes across the table. It's the only way to avoid massive casualties. You don't know if you can beat him, neither do you, but one of us has to try. The king moved around the table, his expression darker than she'd ever seen it. This isn't negotiable. Yes, it is. Selene stood her ground. I'm not your property to protect. I'm the White Wolf Queen. And if my power can end this war before it destroys the Empire, that's my choice to make. Kaelor grabbed her arm. If you die, then you'll have to rebuild without me. Just like I'd have to rebuild if you fell in battle. That's different. How? Because you're the experienced warrior, and I'm the servant girl who got lucky? The accusation landed hard. Because you're my mate, Kaelor said roughly, and I already spent 200 years buried alive. I can't survive losing you too. The raw vulnerability in his voice shattered something, but Selene couldn't let it change her mind. I love you, she said quietly, but I'm not backing down. The king's jaw clenched. Then we fight together. No. One of us needs to survive to protect the Empire. Kaelor's silver eyes burned with fury and fear and desperate frustration. You're asking me to watch you walk into potential death and just accept it. I'm asking you to trust that I'm strong enough to survive. She held his gaze. The same way I trust you when you make impossible choices. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Kaelor stepped back, his expression shuddered. Fine, but I'm sending our best warriors with you. And if this goes wrong, I'm raising Dravos's empire to ash and making sure history remembers why. Fair enough. The council dissolved into logistics and preparation, but Selene barely heard any of it, because she'd just committed to single combat against an emperor she knew nothing about. An alpha who'd been consolidating power for decades while she'd been scrubbing floors. She'd either save the empire or die trying. And there was no turning back now. The journey to the neutral ground where Selene would face Emperor Draven took 8 days through territory that grew progressively more hostile. Kaelor insisted on accompanying her despite every strategic argument against it. He rode beside her in grim silence, his black wolf barely contained beneath his skin, radiating the kind of tension that made even their own warriors give them wide berth. Selene understood his rage. She felt it mirrored in her own chest, the terrible awareness that they were gambling everything on her ability to survive combat against an opponent who'd been training for war since before she was born. But understanding something didn't make it easier to bear. On the fourth night, camped in a forest clearing with 24 elite warriors standing guard, Kaelor finally broke his silence. "You don't have to do this." Selene looked up from sharpening her blade. "We've had this conversation. I know." His jaw tightened. "I'm having it again anyway." She set down the whetstone. "What do you want me to say? That I'm terrified? That I lie awake every night wondering if I'm strong enough?" "I am. But backing down now means watching 50,000 soldiers tear apart everything we've built. There are other options. Name one that doesn't involve massive casualties." Kaelor was silent because they both knew there weren't any. Dravos had made his intentions clear through the diplomatic channels. Complete territorial concession or total war. The challenge to single combat had been Selene's gambit to force a third option, and the Emperor had accepted with disturbing eagerness. That should have been the first warning. "Tell me about him," Selene said. "You ruled during the same era. You must have known Dravos before the imprisonment." The king's expression darkened. "We were allies once, then rivals. He wanted to expand his empire through conquest and trade agreements. I told him it would destabilize the region. Were you right?" "Probably. But I was also being territorial." His voice turned bitter. "Two alphas can't share power without eventually trying to destroy each other. It's not strategy, it's biology. And now I'm walking into combat with him. Now you're betting your life that 3 months of training with me is enough to match his decades of experience." The brutal honesty was cutting. But Selene appreciated it more than false reassurance. "Teach me something," she said. "One thing that might give me an edge." Kaelor studied her across the fire. "Dravos fights like a tactician. He'll study you, look for patterns, exploit weaknesses. Every move is calculated. So how do I beat calculation? Chaos." His eyes gleamed. "Do something so unexpected that his tactical mind can't process it fast enough. Make him react instead of plan." "Like what?" "That's the problem with chaos." He smiled grimly. "If I could predict it, it wouldn't work." They sat together watching the fire burn down to embers, both of them aware this might be the last peaceful moment they'd have. "If I don't make it back," Selene said quietly, "don't let grief turn you into the monster you were before." Kaelor's hand found hers. "And if you do make it back, don't let victory convince you that violence is always the answer. Deal." The neutral ground was a massive stone arena built centuries ago for exactly this purpose. Single combat between rulers to settle territorial disputes without the waste of full-scale war. The structure had fallen into disrepair, vines crawling up the walls and sections of seating collapsed into rubble. But the fighting pit at the center remained intact. A circle of packed earth 60 feet across, surrounded by carved stone depicting ancient battles and forgotten victories. Emperor Dravos arrived with an entourage that made Kaelor's small force look pathetic by comparison. 300 warriors in polished armor, banners snapping in the wind, a show of strength designed to intimidate before the first blow was struck. The Emperor himself was everything Selene had feared. Tall and powerfully built, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered. His hair was dark streaked with silver, his face hard and handsome in that way powerful men often were. But it was his eyes that made Selene's wolf stir uneasily. Flat and calculating, the eyes of someone who viewed people as resources to be used or eliminated. He studied Selene from across the arena with open assessment. "The White Wolf Queen," he said, his voice carrying easily. "I've heard the stories. Servant girl cursed from birth who freed the Shadow King and conquered an empire in 3 months. Quite the fairy tale." Selene kept her expression neutral. "And yet you agreed to this challenge. Because fairy tales are useful for morale." Dravos smiled. "But they don't change the reality of power. You're untrained and desperate." "I'm neither." "Then this should be quick." His smile widened. "I certainly hope so." The rules were simple. Combat until submission, unconsciousness, or death. No weapons beyond natural wolf form and whatever could be found in the arena. No interference from allies. Winner claimed the disputed territories and the loser's empire swore fealty. Everything Selene and Kaelor had built balanced on the outcome of this fight. Kaelor pulled her aside before she entered the pit, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "Come back to me," he said roughly. "I'll try." "That's not good enough." Selene cupped his face, feeling the tension vibrating through him. "Then I promise. I'll fight like hell, and I'll survive because we have an empire to build, and I'm not leaving you to do it alone." His kiss was desperate and claiming and tasted like goodbye despite her promise. Then he stepped back and let her go. Selene walked into the arena alone. The combat started fast and brutal. Dravos shifted immediately, his wolf form massive and dark gray, scarred from decades of battles. He didn't waste time with posturing or threats, just attacked with the efficient violence of someone who knew exactly how to kill. Selene barely dodged the first strike, her white wolf form responding on instinct more than training. His jaws snapped shut inches from her throat. His claws raked across her shoulder, drawing first blood. The crowd that had gathered to watch roared. Most were Dravos's people, enjoying the spectacle of their emperor dominating the upstart queen. Selene's wolf snarled and she drove forward, using speed instead of strength. Her teeth found purchase on his foreleg and she tasted blood. Not a killing blow, but enough to prove she wasn't defenseless. Dravos shook her off and circled, his movements precise and controlled. He was studying her, learning her patterns, exactly like Kaelor had warned. So Selene stopped thinking tactically and let instinct take over. She feinted left, then drove right, then abandoned the attack entirely and rolled beneath his guard to tear at his exposed belly. The move was sloppy and desperate and completely unpredictable. It worked. Dravos howled and backed away, blood streaming from the wound. The crowd's roar changed pitch, uncertainty creeping in. For the next 10 minutes, they tore at each other with savage intensity. Selene fought like someone with nothing to lose, all chaos and determination. Dravos fought like a tactician trying to impose order on a situation spiraling beyond his control. And slowly, impossibly, Selene started to gain ground. Not through superior skill, through sheer refusal to stay down. Every time Dravos knocked her aside, she got back up. Every wound he inflicted just made her more dangerous. The servant girl who'd survived 6 years of being told she was worthless had learned exactly how much punishment a body could absorb and keep fighting. Dravos was starting to realize he'd underestimated her, but he had one advantage she didn't see coming: experience with dirty tactics. He shifted back to human form suddenly, the transformation catching Selene off guard. Before she could adjust, he grabbed a broken piece of arena stone and drove it toward her exposed throat. The rules said no weapons beyond what could be found in the arena. Technically, legal. Absolutely dishonorable. Selene twisted desperately, the stone grazing her neck instead of puncturing. Blood sprayed hot and immediate. She shifted back to human form, gasping, her hand pressed against the wound. Dravos stood over her with the bloody stone. "Smart," he said conversationally. "Most opponents wouldn't have dodged that. You might actually survive longer than I expected." Selene's vision swam. The neck wound wasn't fatal, but it was bleeding heavily. She had maybe minutes before blood loss made fighting impossible. The crowd was silent now. Even Dravos' supporters seemed uncomfortable with the dishonorable strike. Across the arena, Selene saw Kaelor being physically restrained by their own warriors. His black wolf was trying to tear free, to violate the rules and intervene. But doing so would forfeit the match and doom the empire. He had to watch her die and do nothing. The cruelty of it was exquisite. Selene forced herself to stand, blood streaming down her chest. Her white wolf surged beneath her skin, rage and determination burning away the edges of consciousness. "You should have stayed down," Dravos said. "Probably." Then she shifted and attacked with everything she had left. The final exchange was vicious and desperate. Two wolves locked together, teeth and claws, and the terrible intimacy of combat that only ended when one of them stopped moving. Selene felt her strength failing, felt the blood loss dragging her toward unconsciousness, felt victory slipping away despite everything she'd sacrificed. And then Dravos made his mistake. He went for the killing blow to her throat, the same move that had nearly worked before. But this time Selene was ready. She twisted, and his momentum carried him past her guard. Her jaws closed around the back of his neck. One perfect bite that severed his spine. Emperor Dravos collapsed, his wolf form dissolving as death claimed him. Selene stood over his body, swaying, barely conscious. Blood covered the arena floor. Her own wounds screamed for attention. But she was alive. She'd won. The silence that followed was absolute. Then someone in the crowd started to cheer. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire arena erupted in sound that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with witnessing something impossible. The White Wolf Queen had killed an emperor in single combat. Kaelor reached her first, breaking through the crowd's chaos to catch her before she collapsed. His hands were shaking as he pressed fabric against her neck wound, his silver eyes wild with fear and relief. "You promised," he said roughly. "I kept it. Barely. Good enough." She passed out in his arms while warriors from both empires stood frozen, trying to process what they just witnessed. The victory should have ended everything. Instead, it started something far worse. Selene woke 3 days later in a medical tent with her throat bandaged and her body wrapped in enough healing salves to stock an apothecary. Kaelor sat beside her bed looking like he hadn't slept since the fight. "Welcome back," he said quietly. "Did it work?" Her voice came out raspy and painful. Did they honor the terms? The king's expression turned complicated. Dravos's generals accepted the territorial concessions. His empire swore fealty. Legally, we won everything. But his son is calling for your execution, claims you fought dishonorably by using your mate bond to distract his father before the killing blow. That's insane. I nearly died. Truth doesn't matter. Kaelor's jaw tightened. He's rallying support among the annexed territories. Says the challenge was invalid because you used illegal advantages. Can he actually make that argument stick? In their courts? Absolutely. They want any excuse to void the terms and restart the war. Selene tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Everything hurt. So we traded one war for another. Not yet. But it's coming. The tent flap opened and Lady Tessia entered, her expression grim. "We have a bigger problem," she said without preamble. 3 of our own provinces are threatening secession. They're using the same argument as Dravos's son, claiming the White Wolf Queen is too unstable and dangerous to rule. Kaelor stood. "Which provinces?" "Western territories. The ones that suffered most under Dominion taxation." Tessia's voice was carefully neutral. "They're saying you promised them autonomy and protection. Instead, you've dragged them into imperial conflicts and nearly gotten their queen killed." The betrayal was stunning, because those were the provinces Selene and Kaelor had fought hardest to liberate, the territories they'd bled for. And now they were using that freedom to tear the empire apart. "This is what happens when you build power on idealism instead of fear," Kaelor said bitterly. "The moment things get difficult, everyone remembers they have a choice." Selene felt something cold settle in her chest. "That's not fair, isn't it?" The king turned to face her. "We gave them autonomy. Promised they could leave peacefully if they wanted. Now they're using that promise as a weapon against us. So what's the alternative? Force them to stay at sword point and prove we're exactly like the Dominion?" The silence was devastating, because they were both right and both wrong, and there were no good options. Lady Tessia cleared her throat. "There's one more thing. A messenger arrived from the capital. The noble houses are calling for a formal inquiry into your fitness to rule." "Based on what grounds?" Kaelor's voice went dangerous. "Instability. Recklessness. The claim that you're allowing your mate bond to override sound strategic judgment." Tessia met his eyes. "They want Selene removed from power. Some are even suggesting she should be imprisoned for the Empire's safety." "Over my dead body. That can be arranged too." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Because this was the real cost of trying to rule differently. The moment you showed vulnerability, the moment you admitted you didn't have all the answers, every enemy saw an opening. And enemies weren't just external anymore. They were internal, built from the same nobles and provinces they'd tried to protect. Selene looked at Kaelor and saw her own devastation reflected back. They'd sacrificed everything to build something better, and it was falling apart anyway. "Maybe we were wrong," she said quietly. "Maybe empires can't survive without tyranny holding them together." Don't, Kaelor said sharply. Don't let them break you like this. They're not breaking me. I'm just seeing reality clearly for the first time. The king moved to her bedside. Reality is that power is always contested, always fragile. The question isn't whether we face opposition. It's whether we have the strength to keep fighting despite it. And if I don't? His expression turned fierce. Then I fight for both of us until you remember why we started this in the first place. The formal inquiry was scheduled for 2 weeks later in the Throne Cathedral. Selene spent that time healing physically, while everything else deteriorated. Reports came daily about provinces on the edge of rebellion, noble houses consolidating opposition, and Dravos' son gathering forces for potential retaliation. The Empire was fracturing along every fault line they'd tried to repair. Kaelor worked himself to exhaustion, trying to hold it together through diplomacy and strategic concessions, but even he couldn't be everywhere at once. On the night before the inquiry, Selene found him in the war room surrounded by maps and looking ready to set the entire kingdom on fire. "This isn't sustainable," she said. "I know. So what do we do?" The king looked at her with exhaustion and frustration and something that might have been defeat. "Honestly, I don't know anymore. Every choice we make creates new enemies. Every compromise weakens our position. And I'm starting to think you were right. About what? That maybe some systems are too broken to fix. Maybe we should have just burned it all down and started over." The bitterness in his voice was cutting, because that was Kaelor's fundamental truth. Violence was the language he spoke fluently. Building required translations he wasn't sure he could maintain. "You don't believe that," Selene said. "Don't I?" He gestured at the maps. "We've been ruling for 8 months. In that time, we've faced 1 assassination attempt, 3 provincial rebellions, 2 trade embargoes, and now a formal inquiry into your fitness to lead. What part of this looks like success? The part where children aren't being conscripted anymore, where omegas can't be sold for debt, where people have the freedom to question authority without being executed, all things that make ruling exponentially harder." "Good. It should be hard." Kaelor slammed his fist on the table. "Why? Why should doing the right thing always be the path that destroys us? Because the wrong thing is always easier." Selene moved to stand across from him. "That's literally the entire test. Whether we're strong enough to keep choosing the hard path even when it costs everything. And if we're not, then we fail. But at least we fail trying to be better than what came before." The king studied her for a long moment. "You actually believe that?" "I have to. Because the alternative is admitting that 6 years of being powerless taught me nothing, and I'm just another person willing to crush others to stay safe." The inquiry began at dawn with the Throne Cathedral packed beyond capacity. Selene stood before the assembled noble houses and provincial representatives, her neck wound still visible beneath the formal robes. Kaelor sat on the throne behind her, his presence a silent threat to anyone who pushed too hard. Lord Veyr, the same noble Kaelor had nearly killed months ago, led the prosecution. "The charges are simple," he announced to the crowd. "Queen Selene has demonstrated repeated recklessness that endangers the Empire. The challenge to Emperor Dravos nearly started a new war. Her policies of excessive autonomy have encouraged rebellion. And her relationship with King Kaelor creates conflicts of interest that compromise strategic judgment. The accusations landed like hammer blows." "How do you answer these charges?" Veyr asked. Selene met his eyes. "I answer that every single decision I've made was in service of building an empire that doesn't require grinding people into dust to function. If that's reckless, then yes, I'm guilty," the crowd murmured. "And the challenge to Dravos?" Veyr pressed. "That wasn't reckless. It was the only option that didn't involve massive casualties. I offered myself as sacrifice to spare the Empire from war. A sacrifice you survived. How convenient." The implication was clear. They thought she'd cheated somehow, used illegal advantages or tricks to overcome a superior opponent. Selene felt her wolf stir beneath her skin, rage building. "You want to question my honor?" she said quietly. "Then let's be clear about what you're actually angry about. You're not mad I won. You're mad I survived. Because a dead queen would have been politically convenient." The cathedral fell silent. "That's a serious accusation," Veyr said carefully. "It's the truth. You want me removed because I'm harder to control than a corpse. Because I won't rubber stamp policies that benefit noble houses at the expense of common people. Because I actually remember what it felt like to be powerless under systems you all profited from. Her voice rose, carrying through the space. So, yes, I'm reckless. I'm unstable. I'm everything you're accusing me of. Because I'd rather die fighting for something better than live comfortably maintaining oppression. The crowd erupted in arguments and counter-arguments. Lady Tessia stood then, her voice cutting through the chaos. I'd like to present evidence. Everyone turned to stare. The noble produced documents, tax records, and testimony from provincial governors. Page after page of data showing how Selene's policies had actually improved conditions in the outer territories. Lower taxation, better resource distribution, decreased mortality among conscripted youth. The numbers didn't lie. Under Queen Selene's governance, Tessia said clearly, the empire has become measurably more stable and prosperous. Crime is down, trade is up. Provincial satisfaction has increased for the first time in a century. So if this inquiry is actually about fitness to rule rather than political maneuvering, the evidence speaks for itself. The prosecution faltered, because facts were harder to argue with than emotional accusations. Veyr tried to rally, but the territorial disputes were handled through established diplomatic channels and resulted in favorable terms for Vaelor, Tessia interrupted. Unlike previous regimes that would have defaulted to military action and massive casualties. The inquiry continued for hours, but the momentum had shifted. By the time final arguments concluded, it was clear the prosecution had failed to make their case stick. The vote wasn't even close. Selene was cleared of all charges with overwhelming support from provincial representatives who actually cared about results over politics. But the victory felt hollow, because walking out of the cathedral, Selene saw the faces of the nobles who'd voted against her, saw the calculation in their eyes, the certainty that this was just the first battle, not the war. They would keep trying to remove her, keep undermining her authority, keep looking for weaknesses to exploit. This was what ruling actually meant. Eternal vigilance against enemies, foreign and domestic. Kaelor found her on the palace walls that night, staring out over the city with an expression he'd never seen before. You won, he said. Did I? Selene didn't look at him. Because it feels like I just earned the privilege of fighting the same battle again next month. Welcome to governance, his voice was dry. This is what I tried to warn you about. You were right. I hate being right about this. They stood together in silence, two rulers who'd discovered that winning the throne was infinitely easier than keeping it. What do we do now? Selene asked. We keep fighting. Kaelor's hand found hers. We make the hard choices. We survive the opposition, and we hope that eventually the empire we're building becomes strong enough to survive without us constantly holding it together. And if it doesn't? Then we were always doomed. But at least we'll know we tried. The message arrived 3 days later, a sealed letter delivered by a rider who died of poison before he could be questioned. The wax seal bore the mark of House Marek. Lady Tessia. Kaelor opened it with Selene reading over his shoulder. The contents were devastating. Evidence of a conspiracy within the noble houses. Not just to remove Selene from power, but to assassinate both of them and install a regency council. The plan was detailed and sophisticated, involving multiple houses and foreign backing from what remained of Dravos's empire. But worse was the final paragraph. I cannot stop this alone. The conspiracy runs too deep. By the time you read this, I will either be dead or imprisoned for attempting to warn you. Trust no one in the capital. They have already turned your own guards. The letter ended with coordinates for a meeting place outside the city. It could be a trap, Selene said. Probably is, Kaelor agreed. But if there's even a chance she's telling the truth, we have to go. They left that night with 6 warriors Kaelor trusted absolutely. The meeting coordinates led to an abandoned fortress 3 hours outside the capital, the same place loyalists had hidden during the Dominion years. Lady Tessia was waiting inside, bloodied and exhausted. You came, she said, relief flooding her face. Talk, Kaelor ordered. Fast. The noble explained quickly. The conspiracy had been building for months, funded by noble houses who wanted a return to the old system where aristocracy controlled everything. They'd made contact with Dravos's son, promising him support if he provided military backing for a coup. When? Selene demanded. 3 days. During the Festival of the Blood Moon. They're planning to poison you both at the state dinner and blame it on foreign assassins. How many houses are involved? 12 of the 15 major families. Tessia's voice was hollow. I only discovered the plot because my nephew bragged about it while drunk. When I tried to warn the royal guard, I realized they were already compromised. The betrayal was comprehensive and devastating. Everything they'd built was rotten from the inside. Kaelor's expression went dead. Then we have 3 days to either stop a coup or abandon the capital entirely. We can't abandon the capital, Selene said. That surrenders everything. Staying means trusting guards who might kill us in our sleep. So we purge the conspirators. Based on the word of one noble who might be lying? I'm not lying, Tessia said desperately. I brought proof. She produced documents. Financial records showing payments between noble houses and foreign accounts. Correspondence detailing the assassination plan. Names and dates and evidence so comprehensive it was either genuine or the most sophisticated frame job in history. Kaelor studied the papers, his silver eyes calculating. If we move against this many noble houses simultaneously, it triggers civil war, he said flatly. The provinces will fracture, foreign enemies will exploit the chaos. We'll be fighting on every front. And if we do nothing, we're dead in 3 days. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity. Become the tyrants they'd sworn not to be and purge the aristocracy through force, or maintain their principles and probably die for them. Selene looked at Kaelor and saw the same terrible understanding in his eyes. This was the moment that defined everything. What do we do? She asked quietly. The king was silent for a long time. Then he smiled that dangerous smile that had terrified empires. We become what we have to be. The purge began at midnight. Kaelor led strike teams personally, moving through noble estates with surgical precision. Arrests, not executions. Evidence seized. Conspirators dragged from their beds and imprisoned in the citadel dungeons. By dawn, 12 noble houses had been dismantled, and their leaders were in chains. The capital woke to martial law and the Shadow King standing on the cathedral steps, his black wolf barely contained beneath his skin. This is what happens when you mistake mercy for weakness, he announced to the gathered crowd. We gave you autonomy. We gave you voice. We gave you every chance to participate in building something better. And you conspired to murder your rulers and reinstall the same oppression we fought to end. His voice carried that alpha resonance that made even other predators want to submit. So here's the new reality. The houses involved in this conspiracy are dissolved, their assets seized, their political power terminated. Anyone caught plotting against the throne faces immediate execution. The crowd was silent, frozen between terror and uncertainty. Selene stood beside him, her white wolf shining beneath her skin, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. They'd become exactly what they swore they wouldn't, rulers who maintained power through fear and brutal retaliation. The same system wearing different faces, and the worst part was understanding that it had been necessary, because the alternative was death and the empire falling back into chaos. That night, alone in the royal quarters with Kaelor, Selene finally broke. We failed, she said, her voice cracking. We became them. No. The king pulled her close. We survived them. There's a difference. Is there? We just purged 12 noble houses and instituted martial law. That's exactly what the Dominion would have done. The Dominion would have executed everyone and installed puppets. We arrested the guilty and preserved the innocent. It's not the same. It feels the same. Kaelor held her tighter. I know, but this is what ruling actually costs. Sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong. It's between terrible and catastrophic. And we chose terrible to prevent catastrophic. Selene wanted to argue, wanted to believe there had been another path, but she couldn't find one. The conspiracy was real, the threat was real, and doing nothing would have gotten them both killed. So they'd done what was necessary, and in doing so, they'd sacrificed the idealism that made them different. What happens now? She asked. We live with it. Kaelor's voice was rough. We make the hard choices and we carry the weight, and we hope that eventually we build something strong enough that future rulers don't have to become monsters to survive. And if we can't, then we were always going to fail. But at least we'll fail together. They stood there wrapped around each other, two damaged souls who'd tried to build an empire on principles, and discovered that principles didn't survive contact with reality. The empire stabilized over the following weeks. The purged noble houses were replaced with provincial representatives who'd proven loyal. The conspiracy's foreign backing collapsed when Dravos' son suddenly died under mysterious circumstances that everyone knew Kaelor had orchestrated. Order returned, but the cost was visible in both their faces. Selene looked older, harder, the idealistic servant girl who'd touched the seal replaced by someone who understood that survival required becoming comfortable with violence. Kaelor looked more like the king who'd been imprisoned 200 years ago, certain of his authority, willing to crush opposition before it organized. The monster he'd sworn not to become creeping back in through necessity. Lady Tessia, who'd survived the conspiracy purge and been elevated to chief advisor, found Selene alone one afternoon. "You're losing yourself," she said bluntly. "I'm adapting. There's a difference between adapting and surrendering who you are." "Is there?" Selene's laugh was bitter. "Because from where I'm standing, they look identical." Tessia sat beside her. "I've watched rulers for 40 years, seen them rise and fall. The ones who survive longest aren't the strongest or smartest. They're the ones who remember why they took the throne in the first place. I took it because fate didn't give me a choice. No, you took it because you believed you could build something better than what destroyed you. The question is whether you still believe that." Selene had no answer, because honestly, she didn't know anymore. The final breaking point came 2 months after the purge, a minor provincial rebellion in the Eastern Territories. Nothing major. Just farmers refusing taxation and demanding renegotiation of autonomy agreements. The old Selene would have sent diplomats, would have negotiated, would have found compromise. The new Selene sent soldiers. The rebellion was crushed within a week. The ringleaders executed publicly. The province forced back into compliance through overwhelming military presence. Efficient, brutal, exactly what the Dominion would have done. Kaelor found her afterward in the throne room, staring at reports of the casualties. "You had to," he said. "Did I? Or did I just choose the easy path because I've forgotten how to do this any other way?" The king sat beside her. "What do you want me to say? That we're still the heroes? We stopped being heroes the moment we took power. Now we're just people trying to hold together an empire that wants to tear itself apart. Is that enough for you?" "It has to be, because the alternative is walking away and watching everything burn." Selene looked at him. Would that be worse? The question hung between them like a death sentence, because maybe the empire they'd built wasn't worth saving. Maybe the cost of maintaining it was too high. Maybe they'd become so warped by the demands of power that they couldn't remember why they'd wanted it in the first place. Kaelor's expression was complicated. "I don't know anymore, but I know I can't walk away. This crown is all I have." "It's not all I have," Selene said quietly. "What does that mean?" "It means I need to figure out if ruling beside you is making me better or just making me a different kind of monster." The king went very still. "You're thinking about leaving." "I'm thinking about who I've become in 8 months. The servant girl who freed you believed power could be used for good. The queen sitting here just crushed a rebellion through military force and didn't even hesitate, because hesitation gets people killed. Or maybe because I've stopped seeing them as people and started seeing them as problems to be solved." The words landed like physical blows. Kaelor stood. "If you leave, the empire fractures. The noble houses will see it as weakness and restart the conspiracies. Foreign enemies will invade. Everything we've sacrificed for falls apart." "I know, so you're trapped, just like I am." Selene met his eyes. "No. You're trapped because ruling is all you know. I'm trapped because I chose you, and I don't know how to unchoose you, even when staying is destroying me." The brutal honesty was devastating, because that was the real problem, not the empire, not the politics, not the endless stream of impossible choices. It was them. The mate bond that had seemed like salvation was actually a cage, tying her to a man who could only speak the language of violence, forcing her to adapt to his methods to survive beside him. And she was losing herself in the translation. "What do you need?" Kaelor asked, his voice rough. "I need to leave. Not forever. Just long enough to remember who I am when I'm not constantly reacting to crises. The empire won't survive that. Then maybe it doesn't deserve to." The king's expression went cold. "You don't mean that." "Don't I?" Selene stood. "We've become exactly what we swore to destroy. If the only way to maintain this empire is through tyranny and fear, Then what's the point? The point is that tyranny under us is still better than chaos. That's what the Dominion said. The words hit like a blade between ribs. Kaelor stepped back, his silver eyes blazing with fury and pain, and something that looked like desperation. If you walk away from this, he said quietly, we're done. I can't rule beside someone who might abandon everything the moment it gets difficult. This isn't about difficulty. It's about becoming someone I don't recognize. Then figure it out. But do it while staying, because I can't lose you and the Empire simultaneously. The ultimatum hung between them. Stay and continue becoming a monster, or leave and destroy everything they'd built. Selene looked at the man she'd freed from 2 centuries of burial, the Alpha King who'd taught her to survive, the mate fate had preserved for her across impossible time, and realized she had no idea what the right choice was anymore. I need time, she said finally. We don't have time. Then make time. Because if I stay like this, I'll end up hating you and myself and everything this throne represents. Kaelor's jaw tightened. How long? I don't know. Not good enough. It's all I have. They stood there in the throne room, 2 souls who'd chosen each other in darkness and were discovering that love wasn't enough when power demanded you sacrifice everything else. 3 days, the king said finally. I'll give you 3 days. After that, the Empire needs its queen back, whether you've figured yourself out or not. And if I haven't, then we rule anyway and deal with the consequences. Selene left the capital that night with a single guard and no destination. She rode through provinces she'd helped liberate, seeing them with new eyes. The improvements were real: lower taxes, better governance, freedom from Dominion brutality. But the cost was visible too: military checkpoints, harsh punishments for dissent, the same machinery of control just pointed at different targets. She found herself at the ruins of Moonspire Keep, the fortress where everything had started. The place was empty now, abandoned after they'd moved the government to the capital. Vines had already started reclaiming the walls. In a few years, it would be forgotten completely. Selene walked through rooms where she'd trained and argued and slowly fallen for an Alpha King who'd promised he could be better than his worst instincts. And she realized the terrible truth. Kaelor had been right all along. Empires couldn't survive without someone willing to become a monster to hold them together. The only question was whether she was strong enough to be that monster while somehow staying human, or if trying to do both would just destroy her completely. She stood in the old war room where they'd planned their assault on the capital and made the hardest choice of her life. Not to leave, not to stay, but to become something neither of them had imagined. A queen who understood that ruling required darkness, but refused to let that darkness consume her completely. A balance between Kaelor's brutal efficiency and her own desperate idealism. Not compromising between them, but incorporating both and becoming something entirely new. When she returned to the capital on the 3rd day, Kaelor was waiting on the palace steps. You came back, he said. I did. And? Selene met his eyes. And I'm staying, but not as the idealistic fool who thought principles alone could change an empire, and not as the tyrant you're terrified of becoming, as something in between, someone willing to make hard choices but never comfortable with them, someone who rules through strength but never forgets what powerlessness feels like. The king studied her. That's not sustainable. Probably not. But it's all I've got. What if it's not enough? Then we fail. But at least we fail trying to be something other than the monsters who came before. Kaelor's expression shifted. That's the same thing you said when we started. I know. Maybe I just needed to leave to remember why I stayed. They stood together on the palace steps, 2 damaged souls who'd discovered that love and power and principle were constantly at war with each other, and the only way forward was learning to live with that war instead of trying to win it. The Empire would test them again, probably within days. But for now, they had each other. And the terrible understanding that sometimes staying together required becoming people they barely recognized. The assassination attempt came exactly when Selene expected it. Not from external enemies, not from foreign powers waiting for weakness, from within the palace walls, from the guards they'd trusted, from the servants who smiled during the day and plotted murder at night. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of steel scraping stone. Her white wolf surged immediately beneath her skin, instinct firing faster than conscious thought. She rolled from the bed as a blade stabbed through the pillow where her head had been seconds before. The assassin wore palace livery. Young face, dead eyes. The expression of someone who'd been promised enough gold to make murder feel justified. Selene didn't give him time to recover from the missed strike. Her hand shot out and crushed his throat before he could scream. The body dropped with a wet gurgle, blood pooling across expensive carpets. Kaelor was already awake, his black wolf form tearing through two more assassins who'd breached from the balcony. The violence was efficient and absolute. No hesitation, no mercy, just the brutal mathematics of survival. "How many?" Selene demanded, shifting partially, her eyes blazing silver. "At least 6 in the immediate area." The king's voice came out rough, his wolf barely contained. "Could be more." The door to their quarters exploded inward. 4 more attackers rushed through, weapons drawn, moving with military precision that spoke of professional training rather than desperate amateurs. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a coordinated coup. Kaelor met the first attacker head-on, his jaws closing around the man's sword arm and ripping it clean off. Blood sprayed in arterial bursts. The screaming lasted 3 seconds before the king's claws opened his throat. Selene took the other 3, her white wolf form erupting fully. She was faster than them, deadlier, fueled by 8 months of survival that had taught her exactly how much violence a body could inflict when cornered. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. When the bodies stopped twitching, Selene and Kaelor stood amid the carnage, both of them covered in blood that wasn't theirs. This is what ruling actually looks like. Not the ceremonies or diplomatic dinners or carefully crafted speeches. Just 2 predators standing in a room full of corpses, wondering which of their own people would try to kill them next. "The palace is compromised," Kaelor said, already moving. "We need to get to the war room, secure loyalists and figure out how deep this goes." They moved through corridors that had become a war zone, bodies everywhere. Some were attackers. Some were guards who'd stayed loyal and paid for it with their lives. The smoke Selene had smelled was coming from the eastern wing, where someone had set fires to create chaos. Standard coup tactics. Divide attention. Create panic. Strike while leadership is scattered and confused. Except Kaelor had survived too many betrayals to be caught completely unprepared. They reached the war room to find Lady Tessia already there with 24 elite warriors, all of them bloodied but alive. Maps were spread across the table, marked with attack points throughout the palace and capital. "Status," Kaelor ordered. Tessia's expression was grim. "Coordinated strikes across the city. 12 assassination teams that we know of. 3 noble houses openly declaring for the coup, the rest staying quiet to see which way it breaks." "Who's leading it?" The noble hesitated. "Your old war commander, General Wraith." The name hit like a physical blow, because Wraith had been one of Kaelor's most trusted advisors from before the imprisonment, one of the few who'd known the truth about what the king had become and still believed he could be saved. Apparently that belief had expired. "He's calling for your abdication," Tessia continued. "Claims you've become the tyrant he imprisoned you to prevent. Says the White Wolf Queen has corrupted your judgment and the Empire needs traditional leadership." "Traditional meaning what?" Selene demanded. "A regency council of noble houses." Tessia's voice was flat. "Basically a return to Dominion policies with different names. So everything we fought for gets erased and we're right back where we started. If they win, yes." Kaelor's expression had gone completely cold. That icy calculation Selene had learned to recognize as his most dangerous state. Not rage, not fear, just absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. "How many soldiers does Wrath command?" 3,000 in the city, another 5,000 marching from northern garrisons. They'll arrive within 48 hours. "And our forces?" 1,500 loyalists we can confirm, maybe another 1,000 if provincial militias honor their oaths. Tessia met his eyes. "We're outnumbered 2 to 1 and fighting on multiple fronts." The math was brutal and simple. They couldn't win a straight battle, so they'd have to win a different kind of war. "Where's Wraith now?" Kaelor asked. "The old military fortress on the city's edge. He's turned it into his command center, heavily fortified. Probably expects us to either run or try negotiating. Then we do neither." The king's smile was all edges. "We go straight for him," Cut the head off this coup before it can organize properly. That's suicide, someone said. The fortress has a full garrison. We'd be walking into a kill box. Good. Let them think we're desperate enough to make stupid choices. Kaelor's silver eyes gleamed. Wraith trained me. He knows how I think, which means he'll expect tactical brilliance and overwhelming force. So you're going to give him reckless desperation instead? Exactly. This is what separated competent rulers from great ones. The willingness to do something so insane it circled back around to genius. The ability to turn expected behavior into a weapon by deliberately choosing its opposite. And the understanding that sometimes the best strategy was no strategy at all, just controlled chaos aimed at the enemy's center of gravity. Selene studied the maps. How do we even get inside the fortress? Kaelor's smile widened. The same way I escaped it 200 years ago. Through the sewers. The approach took 3 hours through tunnels that stank of waste and old death. Kaelor led them personally, navigating from memory through passages he'd used during his first reign when paranoia about assassination had driven him to learn every hidden route in the capital. Selene followed close behind, her white wolf form compressed to fit the tight spaces, every sense on high alert. Behind them moved 20 elite warriors, all of them volunteers who understood this was likely a one-way mission. No one had illusions about survival. They were betting everything on speed and surprise and the hope that killing Wraith would shatter the coup's command structure before reinforcements arrived. It was desperate and stupid, and probably their only chance. The tunnel exit opened into the fortress's old dungeons, exactly where Kaelor remembered. The space was dark and empty, repurposed storage now instead of cells. They emerged in silence, weapons ready, moving through the fortress like ghosts. Selene could hear the garrison above them, boots on stone, voices calling orders, the sounds of an army preparing for siege warfare, not expecting infiltration. Wraith's overconfidence was showing. He'd spent too much time fighting conventional battles and forgotten that the most dangerous enemies were the ones desperate enough to abandon convention entirely. They moved up through the fortress levels, killing sentries silently, leaving bodies hidden in alcoves and storage rooms. Every step brought them closer to the command center where Wraith would be coordinating the coup, and every step made Selene more aware of the terrible gamble they were taking. Because if this failed, if they were caught before reaching Wraith, the entire assault force would be slaughtered, and the Empire would fall to a general who believed tyranny was just the natural order reasserting itself. They reached the command center to find it guarded by 30 soldiers in full battle armor, too many to take quietly. Kaelor didn't even try. He shifted to his massive black wolf form and crashed through the doorway like a living battering ram. The guards barely had time to raise weapons before he was among them, all teeth and claws, and the kind of violence that turned trained soldiers into screaming meat. Selene followed immediately, her white wolf form blazing with silver fire. Together they tore through the defenders with surgical brutality while their warriors secured the hallway behind them. The door to Wraith's inner sanctum stood open, almost inviting. That should have been a warning. They burst through to find the general waiting calmly behind a massive desk, maps and battle plans spread before him. He looked older than Selene expected, gray in his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes. But his posture was straight and his gaze steady. The expression of someone who'd been expecting this exact scenario. "Kaelor," he said evenly, "I wondered if you'd come yourself or send assassins." The king shifted back to human form, blood dripping from his hands. "I don't send others to do work I'm willing to do myself. You taught me that." "I taught you a lot of things." Wraith's voice was sad. Apparently none of them stuck. "You're staging a coup to reinstall the same policies that destroyed this empire once already," Kaelor said. "And you're lecturing me about lessons? I'm staging a coup to prevent you from becoming the monster I imprisoned you to stop." The general stood. "Look at yourself. Covered in the blood of your own guards, ruling through fear and summary execution, exactly what you were before the tomb. Those guards tried to kill me in my sleep, because they're terrified of what you've become." Wraith moved around the desk. "You promised the Empire would be different under your rule, that the White Wolf Queen would keep you balanced. But all I see is the same brutality wearing a different crown." Selene felt the accusation like a blade between ribs, because part of it was true. They had become more brutal. more willing to use violence as first resort instead of last. The idealism that drove them initially had been ground away by 8 months of constant crisis, but the alternative had been death or chaos. And choosing survival didn't make them monsters, it made them rulers willing to do what was necessary. "You're wrong," she said, stepping forward. "We're not the same as what came before." Wraith's eyes shifted to her. "Aren't you? You crushed a provincial rebellion through military force last month, executed dissidents without trial, instituted martial law and surveillance programs that make the Dominion look restrained. Because we were facing a coordinated conspiracy to murder us and reinstall the same oppression we fought to end," Selene shot back. "Context matters. Context always matters. That's what every tyrant says while justifying atrocities." The general's voice was tired. "I watched Kaelor go down this path before, promising himself each brutal choice was necessary. Each compromise of principle was temporary, until one day there were no principles left, just power and the willingness to do anything to keep it." The words landed with devastating accuracy. Because that was the real fear, wasn't it? That they were sliding down the same slope the first regime had, that every hard choice was eroding the foundations they tried to build on. But acknowledging that didn't change the immediate reality. Wraith was staging a coup, people were dying, and stopping him was the only way to prevent the Empire from fracturing completely. "Stand down," Kaelor ordered. "Disband your forces, and I'll consider mercy." The general smiled sadly. "No, you won't, because mercy is weakness in your worldview now. You'll execute me as an example and continue ruling through fear until someone stronger comes along to stop you. Then you've made your choice. So have you." Wraith moved faster than should have been possible for someone his age. His hand hit a concealed lever beneath the desk, and the floor dropped away. Selene barely caught herself on the edge, her claws digging into stone. Below was a 30-foot drop into the old dungeons, spiked floors designed to kill anyone who fell. Kaelor wasn't as lucky. He dropped, shifting mid-fall, his wolf form taking the impact but still landing hard enough that Selene heard bones crack. Soldiers poured into the room from hidden passages. Not 30, hundreds. The entire fortress garrison converging on their position. It had been a trap from the start. Wraith had known they'd come, had prepared for exactly this scenario. And now their assault force was cut off, outnumbered, and about to be slaughtered. Selene's warriors fought desperately to hold the doorway, but they were being pushed back by sheer numbers. Within seconds, they'd be overrun. This is what happened when desperation replaced strategy. When you gambled everything on one strike and the enemy anticipated your move. They were going to die here. All of them. And the Empire would fall to a general who believed he was saving it by destroying everything they'd built. Selene looked down at Kaelor, bloodied and struggling to rise in the dungeon below. Looked at her warriors being cut down one by one. Looked at Wraith standing calmly amid the chaos like someone who'd already won, and made a choice that would haunt her forever. She shifted to her massive white wolf form and jumped, not down into the dungeon, up onto the desk, scattering maps and plans. Her jaws closed around Wraith's throat before he could react. One perfect bite that crushed his windpipe without severing it completely. He'd live for maybe 2 minutes, long enough to watch his coup collapse, long enough to understand exactly what his arrogance had cost. The garrison froze. Their general was dying in the White Wolf Queen's jaws, and every instinct told them that attacking now would just make his death faster. "Stand down," Selene snarled, the words coming out distorted through her wolf form. "Drop your weapons or I finish him." The soldiers hesitated. Training warred with loyalty. Orders conflicted with survival instinct. In that moment of uncertainty, Kaelor's voice rang out from the dungeon below. "Any soldier who surrenders now keeps their rank and position under the new regime. Anyone who keeps fighting gets hunted down and executed. You have 10 seconds to choose." The brutal simplicity of it was perfect, because these weren't fanatics. They were professional soldiers following orders from a commander they respected. Take away that commander and give them an honorable exit, and most would choose survival. The first soldier dropped his weapon, then another. Within seconds, the entire garrison was disarming, their officers barking orders to stand down. Selene released Wraith, letting him collapse, choking and dying on the floor. She didn't feel triumph, didn't feel anything except exhausted certainty that this cycle would just repeat. Another crisis. Another desperate gamble. Another brutal choice that eroded who they were. This was what ruling actually cost. Not your life. That would be mercy. It cost your soul, piece by piece, choice by choice, until you looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. Kaelor emerged from the dungeons, limping but alive. His silver eyes met hers across the command center, and she saw the same exhaustion reflected back. They'd won, and it felt like losing. The aftermath of the coup attempt took 2 weeks to fully contain. Wraith died choking on his own blood, his final words a warning that Kaelor was becoming exactly what he'd imprisoned him to prevent. The garrison surrendered completely once their commander was dead. The 3 noble houses that had supported the coup were dissolved, their leaders executed publicly. Efficiency and brutality became the Empire's new language. Selene watched it happen with growing horror and resignation. Every execution was justified, every harsh measure was necessary. Every choice could be defended with logic and strategic reasoning. But the sum total was an empire ruled through fear more than hope. They'd become what they swore to destroy, and everyone could see it except them. Or maybe they could see it. Maybe that was worse. Understanding exactly what they were becoming and doing it anyway because the alternative looked like chaos. Lady Tessia found Selene alone in the palace gardens 2 days after Wraith's death. "You're losing the provinces," the advisor said without preamble. Selene didn't look up from the flowers she'd been staring at without seeing. Define losing. 4 territories have formally requested independence. Another 6 are considering it. They're saying the empire under your rule isn't significantly better than the Dominion, just different flavors of oppression. Are they wrong? Tessia sat beside her. That's the question, isn't it? You and Kaelor started this wanting to build something better. Somewhere along the way, it became about survival, about maintaining power at any cost. What else could we do? Every time we tried compromise or mercy, it got used against us. The conspiracy, the coup. Every enemy saw kindness as weakness, so you became what your enemies expected. The advisor's voice was gentle. And now the people who supported you initially don't recognize what you've built. What's your point? My point is that you have a choice. Keep sliding down this path until you're indistinguishable from every tyrant who came before. Or stop. Reassess. Figure out if ruling this empire is worth what it's costing you. And if we stop, if we show any weakness right now, then your enemies will strike and you'll probably die. Tessia met her eyes. But at least you'll die as yourselves instead of living as monsters. The words hit with devastating clarity. Because that was the real choice, wasn't it? Survival at the cost of becoming unrecognizable, or staying true to principles and probably dying for them. There was no middle path, no compromise that preserved both integrity and power. Just 2 terrible options, and the understanding that whichever they chose would define their legacy forever. Selene found Kaelor in the war room that night, surrounded by reports about provincial unrest and foreign movements. He looked exhausted in ways that went beyond physical, the kind of tired that came from carrying impossible weight for too long. "We need to talk," she said. "If it's about the provinces threatening secession, I already know." He didn't look up. "I'm working on responses now. It's not about that." She moved to stand across from him. "It's about us." That got his attention. His silver eyes lifted, wary. "We're destroying ourselves," Selene said. "Every crisis pushes us further from who we were. Every hard choice makes the next one easier. We're becoming exactly what Wrath accused us of. Wraith staged a coup and died for it. His opinion stopped mattering the moment he betrayed us. Did it? Or was he right that we've become the monsters we swore we wouldn't?" Kaelor stood. "What do you want me to say? That I regret the choices we've made? I don't. Every brutal decision kept us alive and the empire intact. Alive as what? Tyrants ruling through fear? Rulers who understand that peace requires strength." The king's voice hardened. "You want to go back to the naive idealism that nearly got us killed a dozen times? I want to remember why we took this throne in the first place." Selene's hands clenched. "We promised the empire would be different, that people would have voices and choices, that power wouldn't just mean crushing anyone who disagreed. And they do have choices. They chose to conspire against us, chose to stage rebellions, chose to test whether we were strong enough to hold power." His eyes blazed. Every harsh measure we've taken was in response to their choices. So it's their fault we've become this? It's reality. You can't build an empire on good intentions and hope people won't try to destroy it. They stood across from each other, the argument that had been building for months finally breaking into the open. And Selene realized they'd reached the point where their fundamental disagreement wasn't something they could compromise away. It was core to who they each were. Kaelor believed power required being willing to become a monster when necessary. Selene believed becoming a monster meant you'd already lost everything that mattered. Both of them were right. Both of them were wrong. And there was no resolution that satisfied both positions. "What do you want?" Kaelor asked tiredly. "Actually want, not what you wish was possible." "I want us to stop," Selene said. "Take a step back. Figure out if we're ruling this empire or if it's ruling us. And then what? Hand power to someone else? Watch everything we've built collapse? Maybe. If the alternative is becoming people we hate." The king's expression turned cold. "I can't do that. This empire is all I have, all I've ever had. Asking me to walk away is asking me to stop existing." The admission was devastating, because it exposed the fundamental truth. Kaelor defined himself through power and control. Without the empire, he didn't know who he was, but Selene had been powerless most of her life. She knew exactly who she was without authority, and she didn't want to lose that person to the demands of ruling. "Then maybe we can't do this together," she said quietly. The words landed like a death sentence. Kaelor went very still. "You're leaving. I'm saying we might want different things badly enough that staying together destroys us both. After everything we've survived, everything we've sacrificed, you're just going to walk away. I'm trying to save us from becoming the villains in our own story. We're not villains, we're survivors." "There's a difference?" "Yes." The king's voice cracked slightly. "Villains believe they're righteous. We know exactly how terrible our choices are, and we make them anyway because the alternative is worse." Selene felt tears burning her eyes. "That's supposed to make it better?" "It's supposed to make it honest." They stood there in the war room, two damaged souls who'd found each other in darkness, and were discovering that darkness might be all they had left. The choice crystallized with brutal simplicity. Stay together and continue sliding into tyranny, or separate and hope they could each find something worth preserving in themselves. Neither option looked like winning. "I need time," Selene said finally. "Away from the palace, away from the constant crises. Just time to figure out who I am when I'm not constantly reacting. The Empire won't wait for you to find yourself. Then it won't wait." Kaelor's jaw tightened. "If you leave now, during this instability, it sends a message that we're fractured. Every enemy will see it as weakness. Maybe we are fractured. Maybe that's the truth, and pretending otherwise just makes it worse." The king studied her for a long moment. "How long?" "I don't know. Not good enough. It's all I have." He turned away, hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough that stone cracked. "Fine. Go. Figure yourself out. But understand that while you're gone, I'll be holding this empire together any way I can. And when you come back, you might not recognize what it's become, or what you've become." The words hung between them like a prophecy. Selene left that night with 2 guards and provisions for a week. No destination, no plan. Just the desperate need to put distance between herself and the palace before she completely lost herself to its demands. She rode through the capital's dark streets, seeing the city with new eyes. The improvements were real: better infrastructure, lower crime, functioning governance. But there was fear, too. In the way people hurried home after dark. In the military patrols on every corner. In the public execution scaffolds that had become permanent fixtures. They'd built order from chaos, but the cost was a population that obeyed from terror rather than trust. Selene made it to the city gates before the ambush hit. Not from Kaelor. Not from the palace. From something far worse. 50 soldiers in foreign armor crashed from the shadows, weapons drawn, moving with military precision. The attack was coordinated and brutal and clearly designed to capture rather than kill. Her guards died within seconds, cut down before they could even draw weapons. Selene shifted to her white wolf form, silver fire blazing, ready to fight her way free or die trying. Then someone stepped from the shadows and she froze. Because it was impossible. Emperor Draven stood before her, very much alive, wearing the same calculating expression she remembered from their fight in the arena. The emperor she'd killed, the corpse she'd stood over while the crowd cheered her impossible victory. Confused? He asked pleasantly. You should be. That wasn't me you killed, just a very convincing proxy. Similar enough to pass inspection in the chaos of combat. The implications crashed through Selene like ice water. The entire challenge had been a setup, a test, a way to study her fighting style and capabilities while maintaining plausible deniability. And she'd played her role perfectly. Why? She managed. Because I needed to understand what makes the White Wolf Queen dangerous. Dravos circled her slowly. Now I know. You are powerful but untrained, relying on instinct more than strategy, dangerous in the moment but predictable over time. What do you want? The same thing I've always wanted. To expand my empire through the most efficient means available. He smiled. Originally that meant conquest. But watching you and Kaelor tear your own kingdom apart through internal conflict? That's far more cost-effective. You've been orchestrating the rebellions. Not all of them, just helping them along. Providing resources and encouragement to noble houses who were already inclined to oppose you. The conspiracy. The coup. All of it happened naturally. I just made sure it happened when it would hurt you most. Selene's wolf snarled. Kaelor will what? Come rescue you? Dravos's expression turned pitying. He doesn't even know you're gone yet, and by the time he realizes, you'll be in my capital under guard, a hostage to ensure his cooperation when I finally move against Vaelor. The trap had been comprehensive and patient. While they'd been fighting internal enemies, the real threat had been watching and waiting and building strength for the moment they were most vulnerable, and Selene had walked right into it by leaving the palace alone. You won't win, she said. Even captured, I'm still what? The White Wolf Queen? Dravos laughed. You're a servant girl who got lucky and freed an imprisoned king. Powerful, yes, but power without experience or strategic thinking is just a resource waiting to be harvested. He gestured and soldiers moved forward with chains. Not silver this time. Something else. Something that made Selene's wolf recoil instinctively. Obsidian, the Emperor explained. Forged specifically to suppress lunar wolf bloodlines. It won't kill you. Just make shifting impossible and drain your strength until you're manageable. The chains closed around her wrists, and the effect was immediate. Her wolf form dissolved against her will, forcing her back to human shape. The silver fire in her veins guttered and died. She collapsed to her knees, suddenly weak as a newborn. Dravos crouched in front of her. Here's what happens next. You'll send a message to Kaelor. Tell him you've been captured, but you're alive. That I'll release you unharmed if he agrees to territorial concessions and military surrender. He'll never agree. He will. Because for all his brutality and tactical brilliance, he has one fatal weakness. The Emperor's smile widened. He loves you, and love makes even the strongest rulers stupid. Selene tried to fight, tried to call her wolf, tried to do anything except kneel there helpless. But the chains were perfect, draining her strength, suppressing her power, reducing her from the White Wolf Queen to just another prisoner. She'd escaped this kind of powerlessness once by touching a seal and freeing an ancient king. There was no seal here, no desperate gamble that might save her, just the crushing certainty that she'd destroyed everything by leaving at exactly the wrong moment. The soldiers dragged her to her feet and toward waiting horses. Behind them, the capital slept, unaware their queen had just been taken, unaware that the real war was about to begin. And Selene, chains burning against her skin and power locked away, could do nothing but wonder if Kaelor would choose saving her or saving the Empire. Knowing him, understanding how he thought, she was terrified the answer was the Empire. Because that's what kings did. They sacrificed what they loved for what they ruled. And she'd just given him the perfect excuse to prove he was still capable of that kind of ruthless calculation. The message reached Kaelor at dawn, delivered by a rider who collapsed dead from poison before he could be questioned. Inside the sealed envelope was a single page in Selene's handwriting. I'm alive. Captured by Dravos, he wants territorial concessions and military surrender in exchange for my safe return. Don't do it. Don't sacrifice the Empire for me. I knew the risks when I left. Whatever happens, remember why we started this. Remember that some prices are too high even for love. The letter ended there. No signature. Just her distinctive script and a bloodstain in the corner. Kaelor read it 3 times, his expression completely unreadable. Then he called the War Council. Lady Tessia arrived to find him standing over maps with that same cold calculation she'd learned to recognize as his most dangerous state. "You're planning a rescue," she said. "No." The king didn't look up. "I'm planning an invasion." "There's a difference?" "Yes. A rescue implies trying to save one person. This is about destroying the emperor who dared touch what's mine." The possessiveness in his voice was terrifying, because this wasn't love. This was something darker. The absolute refusal to accept loss. The determination to burn the world rather than admit defeat. This was the monster Wrath had warned about. "Kaelor, you can't... Watch me." He began issuing orders with mechanical precision. Full military mobilization, every soldier, every resource, every alliance called in. They were going to war, not for territory, not for political gain, for vengeance. And nothing, not reason or strategy, or the survival of the empire itself, was going to stop him. The invasion force assembled in 3 days, faster than any military mobilization in the empire's history. Kaelor stood on the palace ramparts watching 20,000 soldiers organize into battle formations below. Every warrior who could hold a weapon, every provincial militia called to service, every alliance cashed in for this single desperate strike. Lady Tessia found him there, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "This will break us," she said quietly. "Even if we win. The cost of fielding this army will devastate our economy for years. Then we'll rebuild from devastation." The king's voice was flat. "I'm not negotiating the return of what's mine. She's a person, not property." Kaelor's hands tightened on the stone. "I know exactly what she is, and I know what happens if I let Dravos think he can take her without consequence. Every enemy in the world sees weakness and moves against us. So this is about deterrence? Strategy? This is about the fact that I will burn his entire empire to ash before I let him keep her." The raw honesty was more disturbing than rage would have been, because this wasn't emotion overriding judgment. This was cold calculation that happened to align with possessive fury. The most dangerous combination possible. "You're proving Wraith right," Tessia said, becoming exactly the monster he tried to stop. "Wraith's dead and his opinion doesn't matter anymore." Kaelor finally looked at her. "If you can't support this, step aside. But don't lecture me about restraint when our queen is in chains." "Our queen chose to leave." Her voice was careful. Selene walked away because she was losing herself to the demands of ruling. "Are you sure rescuing her through total war is what she'd actually want?" The question landed like a blade between ribs. Because Tessia was right. Selene's letter had been explicit. "Don't sacrifice the empire for me." She'd understood the mathematics of ruling, had accepted that sometimes individuals got sacrificed for the greater good. But Kaelor didn't care about the greater good anymore. He cared about the fact that his mate was imprisoned, and every moment she stayed captured felt like having his chest torn open. This is what made certain rulers so dangerous, not cruelty or ambition, but the willingness to watch the world burn rather than accept losing the one thing they couldn't replace. "We march at dawn," he said. "Prepare the troops." Tessia stood there for a moment longer, then turned and left without another word. She knew better than to argue with someone who'd already made peace with becoming a monster. The march to Dravos' empire took 2 weeks through hostile territory. They met resistance at every border. Provincial forces loyal to the emperor, fortified positions that had to be taken through siege, ambush sites where Kaelor's vanguard bled for every mile gained, but nothing stopped their advance. Because the Shadow King led from the front, his black wolf form tearing through defensive lines with the same brutal efficiency he'd shown 2 centuries ago. Every battle was a masterclass in controlled violence. Every victory was purchased in enemy blood. His own forces started looking at him differently, not with loyalty or respect, with fear. They were watching their king transform into the legend that had gotten him imprisoned, the predator who solved problems through overwhelming force, the ruler who believed mercy was just weakness waiting to be exploited. And they followed anyway because following was safer than questioning. This is how empires became tyrannies. Not through sudden transformation, but gradual erosion. Each brutal choice normalized the next. Each victory through violence made diplomacy seem inefficient. Until one day you looked around and realized the kingdom you'd built was just a prettier version of what you'd destroyed. They reached Dravos's capital after 14 days of constant warfare. The city was massive, easily twice the size of Vaelor's capital, with walls that had never been breached in 5 centuries. Siege towers and defensive positions designed by master tacticians, a fortress that could withstand years of conventional assault. Kaelor studied it from a hilltop overlooking the valley and felt nothing but cold certainty. He didn't have years, didn't have the resources for extended siege, had maybe 3 weeks before his supply lines collapsed and the army had to retreat or starve, which meant he needed something other than conventional tactics. He needed the kind of desperate gamble that either shattered the enemy completely or destroyed everything in the attempt. The War Council gathered in his command tent that night, maps spread across tables, faces grim with the understanding that they were staring at an impossible task. "We can't take those walls," one commander said flatly. "Not with the forces we have. Not in the time available. Then we don't take the walls." Kaelor's finger traced a line on the map. "We go under them." "The old aqueduct system?" Another commander leaned forward. "That's suicide. The tunnels are narrow, easy to collapse. We'd be trapped underground with no escape." "Good. Let Dravos think we're stupid enough to try conventional siege. Meanwhile, we move half our forces through the aqueducts and hit them from inside. That's still thousands of soldiers trying to navigate unknown tunnels in enemy territory." "Yes." Kaelor's smile was sharp. "Which is why I'm leading it personally." The tent erupted in objections. "My lord, you can't risk yourself like this. If you die in those tunnels, the entire campaign collapses." "Then I won't die." The absolute certainty in his voice silenced everyone, because they were watching someone who'd stopped caring about personal survival, who'd calculated that the only thing that mattered was getting Selene back and everything else was acceptable collateral damage, including himself. This was the difference between strategic brilliance and suicidal recklessness. Often, they looked identical until you knew the outcome. "We move tonight," Kaelor said, "full secrecy. Anyone who can't keep their mouth shut stays behind." The infiltration began 3 hours before dawn, with 5,000 soldiers following Kaelor into tunnel entrances that hadn't been used in decades. The passages were exactly as dangerous as predicted, narrow and crumbling and full of cave-ins waiting to happen. They lost 300 soldiers in the first hour to collapsed sections and flooding. Kaelor kept moving, because this was what command actually meant, not inspiring speeches or tactical genius, just the willingness to sacrifice everything and everyone to achieve the objective. The same ruthlessness that had made him a legendary king before. The same ruthlessness that had gotten him imprisoned as a monster. They emerged inside the city walls as dawn broke, bursting from drainage grates and sewer openings directly into enemy territory. The surprise was total. Dravos's forces had been expecting siege warfare, not infiltration. What followed was chaos. 5,000 soldiers spreading through the city like a plague, opening gates for the main army, engaging defenders in brutal street combat. Buildings burned, citizens fled screaming. The carefully planned defenses collapsed into pandemonium. Kaelor moved through it all with single-minded focus, not toward military objectives, toward the palace at the city's center where intelligence said Selene was being held. Nothing else mattered, not the broader battle, not strategic positions, not even the survival of his own forces, just finding her. He tore through palace guards like they were paper, his black wolf form unstoppable and terrifying. Soldiers scattered before him. Some tried to stand and died for it. Most just ran. By the time he reached the dungeons beneath the palace, his fur was matted with blood, and he'd lost track of how many he'd killed. The cell door was reinforced steel inscribed with symbols designed to contain supernatural prisoners. Kaelor shifted back to human form and simply tore it off the hinges through brute strength and determination. Inside, chained to the wall with obsidian manacles, was Selene. She looked terrible. Thin and pale, her white hair matted with sweat and dirt. The chains had been draining her constantly for 2 weeks, keeping her weak and powerless. But she was alive. Her silver eyes opened when she heard him enter. The expression that crossed her face was complicated. Relief and fear, and something that might have been resignation. "You came," she said, her voice hoarse. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped you wouldn't." That you'd choose the Empire over me. Kaelor moved to her, his hands gentle despite the violence still humming through his system. The Empire doesn't mean anything without you. That's the problem. Her eyes held his. You just burned your way through an entire city to rescue one person. Thousands are dead. The campaign has bankrupted us. And for what? To prove you can't let go? To prove that some things matter more than crowns and kingdoms. He broke the obsidian chains with his bare hands, ignoring the way the metal burned his skin. Selene collapsed forward and he caught her, cradling her against his chest. For a moment, they just held each other amid the destruction and chaos. Two souls who'd found each other in darkness and were discovering that darkness might be all they'd ever have. We need to leave, Kaelor said finally. The city's falling, but Dravos is still out there somewhere. Let him go. Selene's voice was weak but determined. We won. We got what we came for. Continuing the slaughter just proves we're the monsters everyone fears. He's the one who took you, and you're the one who burned a city in response. She pulled back.